Thank you. And like I was saying, I'm asking for a little bit of grace as I'm going to be hosting our workshop series today. Kind of, I have, our group that we rely on, but I feel like Shani brings a special something to our workshop series, and I'm going to miss her today. So just appreciate all the work that she does for us and the work she does for IMP. I'm going to be sharing my screen, and we're going to go over today's outline and introduction, and also going over our reading that we had, that I had posted in our Google Classroom. So I'm going to go ahead and start that now. And then if you guys can just throw like an emoji or something up so I can see that you are seeing my screen, that would be great. Are we good? All right, cool. So I'm also going to put this in presentation mode, and that is a little tricky. So if for some reason you are not able to see my PowerPoint, because sometimes there are technical difficulties, I am delivering this presentation from the Fort Hall Indian Reservation, and so that has its own technological challenges, as well as there's actually a snowstorm outside right now. So we're still waiting for spring, but please let me know if things aren't working. Okay. So today's workshop series is our third series on Indigenous knowledge today. Today is the 21st, and we have only 2 more today and next week, and our workshop series is over. It's kind of sad. So a few reminders, please mute your mic. We are having a safe space for discussion, so to have respect for all. We're honoring our spaces of learning. And so, supporting each other and being comfortable saying, I don't know, and relying on our fellow colleagues in our discussion is important. We're also going to be honoring moments of pause, as we're going to be talking about various topics that might cause some discomfort, and we're going to grow through those and again be relying on each other to have a safe space of learning. And we're going to make sure to take care of our needs. So this is a long workshop series. It's 4 hours, and we try to have breaks, but sometimes we're just in it. And so if you need to step away to get some water or use the restroom or get some food, please feel free to step away and come back and take care of your needs as you need. Okay, so this is what I was talking about, Sam. So the workshop series agenda for today, looking at Indigenous knowledge. So the first hour, we're going to be going over our introductions, which we're doing right now. We're going to be looking at our reading, like I had mentioned earlier, and having our workshop discussion. So our reading for this week was A Woodcutter's Story, Perceptions and Uses of Mathematics on the San Carlos Apache Reservation. And then we're going to be going into our breakout rooms. And I feel like we've gotten a pretty good groove as far as our collaboration and breakout rooms. And this is actually kind of one of my favorite parts about our workshop series. And then the next session, we're going to be hearing from the author of the article we read, Dr. Philip Stevens, and he's going to be talking about Indigenous ways of knowing in Apache mathematics. Third session, we're going to be having a presentation from Dr. Sami Matza, Jr., and he's going to be sharing about Indigenous research methodologies and methods. And then the last session, we're going to be showing a film that is celebrating the nonprofit that my husband and I co-found called River Nua, and the film is called River of Return. And so we'll be showing that, and then I will be sharing a brief presentation, but opening things up for a Q&A, where we can all look at what Indigenous knowledge and community-centered learning looks like on the ground within our tribal communities, specifically within the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. So that is the outline for today. After we get going, I'm going to be posting this PowerPoint on our Google Classroom. Okay, and so now we're going to be getting into the formalities of today's workshop, looking at Indigenous Mentoring Program and what is it. So the purpose of this workshop is to mentor faculty, staff, and administrators who work with or are interested in working with American Indian and Alaska Native students in graduate degree programs. This program is curated by UI College of Graduate Studies, Office of Tribal Relations, Pacific Northwest Circles of Success, Mentoring Opportunities in STEM, and Idaho EPSCoR, with an audience made up of University of Idaho faculty and staff, Indigenous scholars, mentors, collaborators, and partners. And I think the really great thing about our workshop series for this year is that we have some good participation from our partnering colleges too. So we have some ISU people here, Boise State, and people from much further away. So this is really awesome. And also just to give our land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that statewide, the University of Idaho resides on the homelands of the Nimiipuu, the Palouse, the Shitsumps, Coeur d'Alene, Kootenai, the Nua, Shoshone Bannock, and the Shoshone Paiute tribes. We extend gratitude to the Indigenous people that called these places home since time immemorial. UI recognizes that it is our academic responsibility to build relationships with the Indigenous people to ensure integrity of tribal voices. And this workshop series is sponsored by the University of Idaho College of Graduate Studies, the University of Idaho Office of Tribal Relations, and Idaho EPSCoR. All right. So we've worked our way through how IMP is able to provide these workshop series and the introduction to the IMP. We're going to go ahead and get into our reading, but before we do, I'm going to stop sharing and have a quick check-in with everybody. So if you could, it's always exciting and interesting to see where everyone's coming from. So in the chat, if you can share where you are zooming in from, that would be really awesome. Oh, Boise. Got Moscow. All right. I'm gonna open this up. Oregon. Oh, Pocatello. Oregon. Awesome. Utah. So is it snowy everywhere? Or is it just here in Fort Hall and Pocatello?
It's trying to snow here, but it's not happening just yet.
Oh man. Yeah, we're just waiting for springtime. All right, awesome. And so before we get into the article, just a reminder, it is posted on Google Classroom, the PDF along with the citation. And the reason that we're delivering information this way is because, as scholars and educators and faculty, it takes time to like look up an article and download it and or the citation and things like that. So we're really trying to provide information that's, easy at your fingertips and hopefully that encourages you to read the material. If you have not read the material, I highly suggest you do because there is some really great work happening in our communities. And then I'm just curious because I think Dr. Stevens is an amazing professor. Who has had him in a class at U of I? All right. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to get back into our presentation because I really want us to have time for discussion. Okay, so Dr. Stevens has written a really amazing article called A Woodcutter Story, Perceptions and Uses of Mathematics in the San Carlos Apache Reservation. Um, Dr. Stevens is an associate professor of anthropology and director of American Indian Studies at the University of Idaho. And I just, I wish we had more time to go over the literature we're, really discussing, but I think we're going to have a great opportunity where Dr. Stevens will be able to talk to us in depth about his article. So these are more of like highlights and snapshots of the reading, hopefully generating good discussion at the end of this session. So I pulled a quote from this article, and I really loved it because it just situates Dr. Stevens right from the beginning. And so he says, "My research is born from the tenacity of my community, which lies in the strength of our intelligence, the memory of what the world should be like, and the persistence of courage in the face of overwhelming challenges brought about by social changes." Um, So within the article, Dr. Stevens talks about the different ways Apache way of knowing is rich and produces different perspectives and generates infinite questions within mathematics and learning. Um, Dr. Stevens said, "My childhood experience of making wood offers one example of complex mathematical understandings embedded in everyday Apache life." And then he goes on to say where in general education settings, students are asked to memorize and recite content isolated from application. And so when I was in the IKEEP program, or the Indigenous Knowledge for Effective Education program, Dr. Stevens was very influential and critical in how we as Indigenous educators were looking at incorporating and centering and highlighting our Indigenous knowledge in our learning. And I think this is a really good example of how when we include Indigenous knowledge, we are providing rich context for our kids to learn. In this article, it discusses culture schooling and mathematics, how mathematics education has served as a gatekeeping subject and content area, that there is binary of mathematics as being something taught in school spaces, whereas being Apache is something taught outside of school, and there is no bridging of the two. And so these ideas of ways of knowing and mathematics are oftentimes separate and thought of like we do math in the school, and then outside is like it's not math, which is harmful for our young people. The term mathematics, as understood in school settings, is used to indicate the limited scope of Eurocentric taught presented as mathematics itself. So including the word mathematics sometimes is excluding or making Indigenous students feel excluded from mathematics. Indigenous mathematics, this perspective will serve the overall goal of better education for Indian students. The mathematics lesson makes intuitive sense. There are many Apache stories shared that hold many meanings. Some of these meanings reveal themselves with age, some with special experience, and some only when needed. And I think this is really great, and we see this over and over in Indigenous communities. I like to use the example. I am also a high school teacher. I teach part-time currently, but when talking to our students and, the idea of STEM, and when they have to dissect an animal and they just won't do it, there's not much sense made in dissecting something and not following the values of our cultural ways of knowing. They take an F and they will not participate. However, these same students are expert hunters and fishermen and women or young people, and they can take an elk apart really easily. They are experts at the anatomy of that animal. And if there was a way to bridge the two in the science classes and in our cultural ways of knowing, it would make more sense and be more intuitive to be looking at dissecting an animal as an example. Dr. Stevens said, I have made the conscious decision to not present my home reservation through damage-centered research. Although traditional Western research methodologies attempt to portray research as objective observations of subjects, I find it very difficult to portray my community as defeated or broken. And so our last week in our Cultural Humilities workshop series, we had talked about how science is taking a side and that you really can't be unbiased when entering these spaces of inquiry, that our life experiences and our identity making and our situating of self heavily direct the things that we want to research or the way that we want to conduct research. And so I thought this was a really great quote from Dr. Stevens, because as Indigenous students and scholars and researchers, we care about our community and we don't want to perpetuate narratives that are still causing harm. We want to take a stance of there's this term called critical participatory action research, and where it includes, some form of social justice in our research. And I see that very much in Dr. Stevens' articles that he writes. So from going from a damage-centered approach to a desired-centered, community-driven action, I think is really important. And I really appreciate that Dr. Stevens is taking that stance. The recognition and inclusion of Apache knowledge would help schools to allow communities to engage as equitable partners in the design, development, and teaching and learning of mathematics alongside educators. And I really like that wording of alongside educators, because it is also discussing the idea of power dynamics. And, as educators, we have the power to direct how and in what way our students are going to be engaging in information, but also there is a power dynamic of, grades and interacting with parents and what materials we include in the classroom. And so when we're having this desired centered education and community driven action, it is saying that we are all on the same playing field, that we are equal teachers and learners and community members, and we're going to engage in this learning as so. And that we are not just a static sepia, toned feather and leather. And I like this quote from Dr. Stevens, and if you've taken his classes or had discussion with them, I always think of him saying feather and leather. So, we can't just keep doing the same thing and slapping on some images of eagles or feathers and thinking that's culturally relevant education, or it's addressing this idea of desired centered community driven action, that it actually takes the action part and that we have to be engaging in moving past just the stereotypical ideas of what it means to be Indigenous or include Indigenous perspective. Okay, so that was a very brief overview. I did want to give some room for discussion. I'm gonna have us break out into breakout rooms, and I'm gonna be posting these things in our chat. When you get into your breakout rooms, you're going to need to assign a facilitator, and this person is going to facilitate who's going to be going in what order of discussion and also be the one to share out at the end. We're going to have a recorder, so someone to be taking notes and then posting those notes on Jamboard, and Jamboard is located on the Google Classroom, and I'll also put it in the chat link. And then a timekeeper. And so we're going to have about 15 minutes of discussion. And then the timekeeper will just be helping everybody along. And then we're going to be looking at these two questions. So within this article, if you were able to read it, or if you just are going to be looking at the slides that I'll be posting shortly, what held meaning to you in this article? Why does it have meaning to you? How does it have meaning to your community? How does it have meaning to the world around us? So any of those directions. And then question 2 is, how can the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge contribute to your specific field? So we keep having these different examples and discussions and critical conversations about inclusion of Indigenous knowledge. And so now I kind of want us to start thinking more directly about the work that we do. How can it apply to your specific field? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And I know that is very brief. I feel like Shani does a really good job of facilitating discussion, so I apologize if it is a little short. And then just a reminder too to make sure your screens are on mute. And then this is the roles. Awesome. Okay. Then I'll get into our Jamboard. Sean, do you want to go ahead and start breaking people into their groups? Perfect, thank you.
They all went to one.
Oh no! Maybe pull everyone out and we'll try again.
They still have 40. There's a timer on it.
Oh no!
At the end.
All right, so just in the being mindful of time, do we have a facilitator that wants to share out for their group? I heard lots of good discussion.
I can share a couple things that I wrote down from our discussion. Yes, we had a lot to say. We got to the second question in the last 30 seconds. So we had a very rich discussion on the first question. But some of the the highlights and things that I wrote down were really how we all took away that importance of integrating knowledge and not separating it out and defining it into these small disciplines. And remembering that there are very different types of knowledge with different perspectives that are all equally as important. We also talked about how the words that you use to refer to knowledge or even to your content have different meaning, and so choosing your words carefully in education and in description of content is very important. We talked about how we really appreciated the explanation of how words like science can be very exclusionary in their nature, and how it's important to allow students to hold on to their whole selves when they're doing things like so-called math and science, and that when you kind of strip those subjects down to this very narrow definition, you're not really allowing people to do that. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, I'll share that we talked about how this kind of mindset with teaching and learning makes it so much more applicable and accessible for everyone, and just has many broad benefits for all audiences.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to highlight, I got to sit in your guys's room for a little bit, how you had talked even about how personal application is beneficial and your own experiences. I think it was with quilting and how you can identify the math with it. I thought that was a really great example. And just how these ways, different ways of knowing, these inclusions of different ways of knowing, specifically right now we're talking about Indigenous knowledge, but just different ways of knowing how much richer our learning is. And if we can have that application, it benefits everybody. It's very, reaches, more learners that way. So thank you guys. The next facilitator, does anyone want to volunteer?
I would like to nominate Liz Red because she was our note taker and she's very articulate.
Certainly, I'm still here. I just was muting. I have to teach at 11, and so I was trying to prep my windows for that while we were talking. We had a similar theme as the last breakout group. We talked about, and I'm trying to make my windows bigger here. We talked first about how the distinction between ethnomathematics and culturally specific mathematics can often frame mathematics that is culturally specific as lesser than compared to Western scientific ways of knowing. I really resonated with that discussion in the article about the term ethnomathematics. And I think about how we use language in general, because that's what I do. We also we thought maybe instead of having another term like Indigenous mathematics, which might frame for some non-native people or non-Indigenous people mathematics as having this idea that there's one other kind of mathematics called Indigenous mathematics. We thought instead to just use terms like Apache mathematics, Shoshone mathematics, to be specific to the community. We did get to question 2, how does Indigenous knowledge inform your field, paraphrasing that question. And Anne talked about how in architecture, they're working with regenerative design, which is a way to understand how Indigenous architecture can actually inform more sustainable architectural practice, if I'm paraphrasing that correctly. And we talked about the concept of epistemic violence and how to move toward more reciprocal and respectful research practices in collaboration with community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think it's really interesting, this conversation of Indigenous ways of knowing, especially when working with tribal communities. So my husband and I, we are working on another grant that was recently awarded. And we're doing community outreach right now. And that is a topic of discussion. And I think it's so interesting and great. And one of the things that we have to communicate with my community or our community is that it's almost like code switching. So when we're using the word Indigenous knowledge, we're speaking to a different audience. We're talking to either institutions or within academic literature, because Indigenous knowledge is so big. There's so many Indigenous peoples and nations and communities across the world. And so when we go into our communities and we're talking about this word Indigenous, it is, it's so beautiful. I just love having these conversations, but it's, our elders telling us, don't forget that we're Shoshone-Bannock, as an example. We are unique and we're special, and we have our own special and unique connections to culture and land and the way that we have our traditional life ways. And so Dr. Stevens' wife, Dr. Vanessa Anthony Stevens, she has a really great article, and it talks about brokering. And I think as Indigenous scholars, we have to figure out how to broker and be that kind of translator in the middle of how to talk to institutions, but also how to not lose our way and still remember that we are first and foremost, for myself, that we're Shoshone-Bannock. And I think that's just a really great point that you made, Liz, and definitely something I could talk about, the rest of the time. But yeah, thank you. That was awesome. And then I think we have one more group or 2 more groups.
I know we haven't talked. There's some stuff going on in my office right now, so I can't talk right now. But I can talk in a minute. I'm sorry.
So the other group go.
I can share real quickly. So hopefully I can remember everything that we talked about. So group members help me out if I forget something. But we shared a lot. Just a couple of highlights that maybe haven't been mentioned yet because we've had some similar currents to what other groups have talked about. But just the importance of stories informing alternate methodologies and how that's critical to attend to. And we talked about the connection with like English language learners and how oftentimes students are asked to forget and to leave, you know, part of themselves out of the picture in this new context of learning a new language or whatever the case might be, and how damaging that is, and how much richer it is when students are allowed to bring who they are into the spaces, especially classroom spaces. And I think that is, oh, and then Erin talked about gaps in like intercultural context, and maybe Erin, you can talk a little bit more about that because I was writing notes down and then didn't fully get a chance to really listen to what you were saying. So if you want to add maybe a little bit about gaps.
Yeah, just talking about, I mean, I'm talking from my perspective as a literature teacher, right? And someone who teaches, you know, world literatures and literatures from different cultures, and asking students to both appreciate the bits in the text that don't make much sense to them, right? Often it can be something as like the way that space is described in the story, right? Or a decision that a character makes or something like that. And then also questioning their own biases and ideas that they're bringing to the text that might not align specifically with the story that we're learning, right? So appreciating the gaps in knowledge and kind of sitting in those gaps and not blowing past them, but really seeing those as sites of rich sites of knowledge production potentially.
Yeah, thank you both. I think it's really interesting to think about language and how I've recently stepped into new roles within my tribal community, you know, being invited into spaces to see how our kids are doing learning in our tribal schools. And it's so interesting because it's the schools that have our language in it that they are actually doing better. And so I think, you know, there's research out there somewhere, I can't cite it right now, but when you include different languages into learning, that's beneficial. And then the idea of gaps, you know, you're reminding me this idea about we could also maybe look at gaps as pauses, and that if we just pause together, you know, we're taking our time, and it doesn't have to be this very linear, like beginning of the year, end of the year, we have to get all this stuff crammed in. But you know, looking at these ideas of Indigenous knowledge, and the other really awesome part is that, as an example, I did a buffalo hunt curriculum building with my school here in Fort Hall, and that hunt we were able to include language arts, science, history, tribal government, PE. We were able to include all those things, and it was a short lesson. It was a day lesson, but just really like able to get a bunch of learning into one place of pause for us as a community. Yeah, thank you guys. Are you ready, Michael?
Yeah, I'm ready now. Yeah, sorry, there was like someone came in and my boss was talking to them, and then they heard me say that, and then they went into the other room. Yeah, so Sebastian and I talked a little bit about one thing I thought that Sebastian said that was great is so he teaches chemistry, and one of the best points is like you could just take this article and just put chemistry into the mathematics, and it probably would like basically say the same thing in a lot of ways. So that was a really good point. The other thing that, you know, from my perspective, I liked a lot was just on like a language level. I liked it when they said in the end, like when the author was talking about the other, they did the thing where they capitalized the O. So there's this whole like idea of the other, which I think there's like an ethical framework baked into that, and like how one like should like sort of have a relationship with the other rather than like diminish it, which I thought was kind of cool. And I was just thinking about like me and my job, and it's hard. Like I used to teach, and now I do more like communications and marketing and outreach and recruitment, and how oftentimes like as an institution, we may want to communicate at people, right? To sort of like get our processes out in a certain way to people, but we oftentimes don't look at that in like a bi-directional way. Like it's sort of like a unidirectional way. It's like, we're going to communicate at you so that you can understand how we work, but we oftentimes don't open up that same outreach and communication in a way that it like creates a dialogue, right? And I don't know, there were just like parts of this where I was just thinking that, you know, you could also probably replace mathematics with like, you know, university bureaucracy as well. And it would have a similar meaning in how I should probably think about that, because oftentimes, you know, my job is just to like automate communication and make people do what we want, you know, and you know, maybe I should be having a more like holistic, like ethical approach to that, you know, than I do. So yeah, that was my thought. It's like half baked, but that's the general thought.
Yeah,
So.
I think there's some really great like places to just, you know, everything that you just said, there's lots of great moments that make me think of like this idea of like not having a prescriptive, like I'm going to tell you what you need, and you know, that I know, because a lot of times we don't know, we don't know what other communities, or different communities I should say, like I'm not an expert in everything. I really love that you said about you could insert a different kind of, you know, context into, instead of mathematics, it could be Apache, you know, all kinds of things. And the point I want to make is that I think a lot of times within Eurocentric thinking and just dominant narratives is that we didn't have those things until colonial contact. And that is definitely not the case. I remember having a class you know, at a university, and there was this discussion that you know, these knowledge systems we didn't have them until, you know, this and this, and I think we were talking about water ecology, and I was like, no, 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 as like a student, right? Like we've had water ecology since, you know, time immemorial. Like this is our huge value system for us, and just because we didn't call it water ecology doesn't mean that it wasn't there. And so I thought that was, you know, a great point that you're making, Michael. So thank you guys. I think we are right on time. We have a hand raised. Heather?
Yeah, I just was thinking on that concept of how important it is for students to feel like they're intelligent. And that when you present it like that and you say, you can do like that, the number of times I've heard people say, I can't do math. I can't, I'm bad at science. I'm not very smart. And when you point out to them, look how you're, so Lauren, look how you're quilting, Lauren. You are good at, right? Whatever this was. And then for them to identify with their intelligence in their own way, and how much more powerful that is as they feed into their future versions, their future stories of themselves. And that's the real opportunity there. I think, Jessica, in your school with your language, is just like, look how smart you all are. This is so neat that you can do all these things. You have just done this, this, and this. And when they're like, oh, I did do that, I am smart. Now all of a sudden they can do so much more.
Yep. I think that's great. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. So we are right on time for our next session. I do want to kind of give everybody a few minutes to breathe for a second, because we had some really great discussion. So I'm going to have us do a 5-minute break, and also that way I can get our presenter and speaker invited guests to ready as well. So we're going to meet back at 9:37. And we'll see you guys in just a bit. Thank you. All right. Sean, Philip, do you need a screen share?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay. Sean, can you make sure that Philip has the ability to share screen? And we just got done talking about how awesome you are, Philip, so.
He should be able to now.
Well, I'm going to destroy those perceptions now.
Yeah, it's so funny. So Malia just realized yesterday that you guys are Apache. And then she's like, what? Because we were talking about today. And
Mhm.
she's like, what? They're Apache? And I was like, yeah, you didn't know that? And we were all driving in the car. She's like, that's why. And I was like, why what? She's like, that's why they're so tough and strong. And I was like, what? And I guess their teacher uh
Yeah,
talks about Apache people she knows and that they're really tough and strong. And it just like clicked for her.
that's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's so the class I just came out of that teaching is on language and culture. And the concepts we were discussing today were the idea of performance and performativity. And this idea that people, performance being that, you know, certain identities within the community act how those things should act. So like in this example, like Apache should act tough, that kind of idea. But what's really interesting, this idea of performativity, where you can play around with those identities, which that's what I do within the classroom, is to an extent, it's the idea of an Apache within the classroom, acknowledging the full history of indigeneity and education, Western education, and playing around with that and undermining these ideas and ideologies. And so, and then letting them know that how that manifests itself, my class know that how it manifests itself is me making fun of these things and kind of making jokes about them, making it seem like, you know, why is my professor, you know, playing WAP in the classroom, a music video, you know, why are we discussing these things?
Yeah.
And because it's constantly in the creation of a new understanding of what professorness should be. And so that would be inclusive of Apache ways of doing, which have been exclusionary. So anyways, that's kind of what it was. It's funny hearing you talk about that because that's kind of what it is.
And then you're just reminding me, and I hope you can bring up some of these points too in a couple minutes, but like when we watched the My Little Pony
Yeah.
tune, that you're totally reminding me that, and just like how like passerbyers were like, what are they watching?
Yeah. No, that's totally that.
Yeah.
So just some logistics for this. How much time?
So it's an hour, it's about 50 minutes. But you can present, I'm sure there's going to be lots of great discussion. So I have right now a running time for about 40 minutes to leave like 10-ish minutes, but we can also be flexible too. Like if we go over a little, that's okay. And then mostly the really great thing about this workshop is that there's lots of really good discussion happening. And also some of your students or former students are here too, so I'm sure they can speak to their experience with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have
Go ahead.
we have 1 more minute and then we're gonna get started. I was just gonna read your like role in the University of Idaho, and then I'm sure you're gonna give your own introduction. So
Well, and then I have a question for you, just, you know, coming on into, there was two things I was thinking about. One, there's a longer kind of going on this idea of Apache pedagogy and epistemic diversity, or this other thing that I wrote for academic rating. And they kind of both introduce this idea of where mathematics come into play. The pedagogy and the epistemic diversity, it's a longer one, and I can zip through those. And then the academic rating is a bit of a shorter one. So one's like, I mean, I'm not going to go through it, but like there's 40 slides, the other is 10.
I think it's up to you. I think both of them would be beneficial. We just got done reading your woodcutters article, and so we're looking at like different ways of including Indigenous knowledge or learning.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
how do you
I
want
think
to
I'll do the rating one then.
Okay.
Okay.
Awesome. And then I'm going to go ahead and get your so I know how to introduce you. And all right, so I think we are all back. Just about. I'll wait for some cameras to turn on. And also thank you for being here. I know you guys are all busy and lots of stuff going on. Did I put the right time? 9:37. Okay. And I have to keep swapping time in my head because we're an hour ahead. All right, so we are returning back from our 5-minute break, and we have Dr. Philip Stevens here with us. I'm going to kind of just have us start moving along, and then I'm sure people will turn their screens on as we go. So we have Dr. Philip Stevens here with us. He is the Associate Professor of Anthropology and Director of American Indian Studies at the University of Idaho. Dr. Stevens is one of the professors at the University of Idaho who has really shaped the way that I look at Indigenous education and how I can feel empowered as a Shoshone-Bannock person and researcher within the institution, really advocating and making some elbow room for my community. So thank you, Philip, for being here. We're very excited to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, there's I guess talking about this idea of indigeneity and oftentimes when I introduce myself, I here in the university I'll start off with She Philip Stevens Gonse to the Hitli Nashi the Shini Banistin She Ma Nalani Gonse She Ta Homer Gonse She Vanessa Gonse. Knowing full well that probably none of you know what I said. And that's, in a sense, that's kind of a little bit of a microcosm of these ideas that we're talking about. I think that, in one certain scenario, you could think of it as this introduction should be allowed in the university. It should have a place there. But also it needs to be recognizable of what it is. I mean, I don't think you should just fully trust me. I could be cussing you out for all you know. So I don't think that you should fully trust me. And I think that's the bit of it, is that intersection between what's known and unknown. I think that that's really where a lot of issues arise in regards to like indigeneity and education. So yeah, that's just kind of as a start off. I'm going to show you a few things really quick. And I'm going to actually, because I want to talk with you. I don't want to talk at you. So I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit and try to leave enough time for us to have a discussion. And please stop me if you have something really ignorant to say. No, I'm just kidding. Something really important to say. I want to talk to a certain extent. I don't want to talk at you, but I'll start off with. Let's see. Hold on one second. You're going to get to see my brilliant skill of working with Zoom. So hold on. Yes. Okay. So I'll start off with this. You all can see that? Yeah? Okay. Research and practice of tribal nation building. That's kind of what I'm going to talk about to a certain extent. And I'm trying now to really, again, start off any of my interactions with the university with Apache to set the stage that this is something that belongs here too. And I really like some of these words that the more diacritics and tonal marks on there that differentiate it and otherize these things and make them exotic, the better. And so Netego Benati, which you can kind of translate that as maybe like good remembering or remembrance, good remembrance, maybe something along the lines of it. And this kind of builds upon an Apache epistemological, ontological, axiological understanding that as people, we're good, we're inherently good, but we're also lazy. So anyways, like I said, I start off with this, and this means, and I'm going to tell you, and you have to believe me because you don't know, but I'm going to be lying to you. This means my name is Philip Stevens. I'm Blackwater Clan, and I'm for Red Earth people. Lies. And then I'm going to move on to this idea, Shike Darajone, which I'm going to tell you means my pretty family or my strong family or my beautiful family. And it becomes important for me to let you know that while I'm kind of joking around with you about the words, those images aren't lying. And especially me setting those things up. I want you to know that I come from a place and I come from a family that have indelible marks upon me. That's a key thing. Now, I'm going to get into a little bit into some of this, the Apache epistemological understandings of things. So, Tudhithinously, which means like I'm Blackwater Clan. And that doesn't even mean that. It means I'm Blackwater. The clan is more of a indicator for non-tribal people to understand, to give it some kind of frame of reference. But this is where I'm from. Like, this is where my clan, my community, my citizens, if you want to think about it, this is like, you know, where Romulus and Remus, you know, were sucking on the tip of the she-wolf. Like right here, this is where it began, that idea. So this becomes important because place is a really important part of identity and knowledge within my community, within my culture. Now, another part of this is these ideas. And there's a couple of jokes here that I'm going to have to explain probably. And the biggest joke, I think, is the fact that I'm citing Keith Basso, who's not Apache. But this is what he says. Western Apaches regard spoken cooperation as a form of volunteer, or spoken conversation as a form of volunteer cooperation, the chi or the chiri, in which all participants are entitled to displays of respect. So I'm going to switch it up and I'm going to say that's true. Speaking too much. Whoops. Speaking too much is a break in the respect. So like what I'm doing right now is being very disrespectful. And I want you to be aware of that. Oops, come on. Because of this, a person who speaks too much, someone who describes too busily, who supplies too many details, who repeats and qualifies too many times, presumes without warrant on the right of the hearer to build freely and creatively into speaker's own depictions. With too many words, such a speaker acts to smother his or her audience by seeming to say arrogantly and coercively, I demand that you see everything that happened, how it happened, and why it happened exactly as I do. In other words, persons who speak too much insult the imaginative capabilities of other people, blocking their thinking, holding down their minds. Are you feeling like your life force slowly leaving you as I'm smothering you? Or are you getting the effect like, wow, he's a really good instructor. He's a really good professor. My cousins definitely feel me smothering them. And when I tell them what I do, they say, and nobody punches you? And I'm like, I know, right? Nobody does. They think I do a good job. I said, up is down, right is left, wrong is right. Topsy-turvy world here in the university. It's so backwards. So that becomes important, kind of just as a framework. And I'm going to shift a little bit. Let's see if I can do this. To this other one. Where I shift a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about academic rating, because this is against the backdrop of university. Because hopefully I set up that you know that the university is a place that's going to smother you, smother Apaches. They like to smother Apaches. And I'm only saying this from an Apache perspective. From the other Indigenous folks I spoke to, they kind of see the same thing too. I want to make sure that this is really clear. The university and schools are contentious, dangerous places. It is not where you want to send your kids. So this idea of academic rating that I'm going to talk about is this old familiar subversive act in a dynamic world. And again, talking from an Apache perspective, it's a play on words that I'm going to be engaging in. Because what we're trying to do is making space for indigeneity in school. The act of academic rating is subversive because it acknowledges and interacts within Western concepts of education as biased and assimilationist for Indigenous communities, despite claims that position Western education as acultural and unbiased. Like, whenever I am in the classroom here at the university, I am fully aware that this is not an Apache way of doing things. Not to go too much into the, oh, you got to pity me, it's so bad, it's so horrible, but it is always, 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 always weird. Always. Reason I say that is because I don't want to leave any room of like, well, it's okay. It's not okay if it doesn't acknowledge these differences. This photo here, let me talk a little bit about this that I get a really big kick out of, because this is the first day that my oldest daughter went to school. And what I like about this is that over here is my oldest daughter. And this is her sister, who they're really close, thick and thin. We're standing waiting for the students to be dismissed. And Carmen, my oldest daughter, runs out. She doesn't see us. She runs out looking for us. And Hazel sees her and she starts running to her to hug her. But she stops right here at this moment because she realized that Carmen doesn't see her, and Carmen's going in this other direction. To an extent, she's kind of maybe not fully running away from her, or why I like this picture, running away from her family, moving away from her family. But that there's something different. She doesn't recognize us. Now, that's all fun and, to be able to put these conjectures on here, because she just really didn't see us. But I like it for this reason. And this is why I put this picture here, because this is her first interaction. And she gets, I like the old, I really like meanings of words, and including English words. And I think of dazzle and the meaning of that, and the idea of having your vision clouded, by magic, by some kind of force outside of you. And that's what I think. She's dazzled here. Anyways, hopefully I'm building this up for you to understand what I'm getting at. So one thing, when I'm talking about this idea of indigeneity, I want to make sure this is really clear that I'm talking right now about Apache indigeneity, and there's so many others. other communities, other tribes, other places. And, you know, I bring this up, the idea of, one time I was playing basketball and somebody asked, one of my colleagues asked me, he's like, well, and sincere, non-tribal person trying to understand this, and was asking, like, if there's so many different tribes, and I can't just say like Native Americans, and I have to say like Apache, Shoshone, Bannock, Paiute, you know, all these individuals, and I can just see it in their minds, like screaming, like, oh my God, it's the balkanization. Things are going to be in disorder, which I'm like, no, I'm me, you're you, and we're fine. But then he asked this question, like, okay, so I'll give you that premise. Like, there's so many, all these different tribes, and they're very different from one another. They're not all the same. If that's true, why is there only one AIST program? And I kind of made this in jest, but I'm kind of a little bit more true, I guess. As I said, because we deal with all the same white guy. The joke being, again, is that if you're going to see us as one monolithic perception or identity, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, kind of an idea, which hopefully drove home that what I was trying to mean with that. So anyways, in regards to this idea of academic rating for students, for Indigenous students, there's this idea of resistance and resilience, because a lot of times within schools, indigeneity and students from Indigenous backgrounds are seen as failing students, substance abuse, poverty, all that stuff that you see, like, you know, that's put out there. Now, what's not always there is this idea of making a space for dynamic identity of indigeneity. Instead, it becomes this really, again, static identity of indigeneity. Like right here, here are two Apache children. And yes, they're playing with a Wii. That's something that I want to make sure that is, it seems really funny. And you might just even in your mind say, oh, these are just two kids. And maybe even think like, oh, maybe two American kids. Because that idea, that identity of American is allowable for this. And you might not necessarily think like, oh, two Indigenous kids, or even less, two Apache kids. Because sometimes that identity isn't allowed. And the other part of it is this persistence and this idea of community. And so what often happens is this idea that you have to, within the education system, within schools, a lot of Indigenous students kind of have to take on this identity that can be seen as a rebel. So students who are trying to engage with education systems often find that there is a complex and nuanced stratagem needed to succeed. The negotiation by Indigenous communities and students is not recognized as evidence of intelligence. Rather, that's just glossed over. So the fact that, again, using me as an example, the fact that when I step inside of a classroom, I have to perform as a Western, you know, epistemological, pedagogical entity negates the Apache-ness of how I want to do these things. Because this is the trick. Oftentimes, how schooling is presented within schools is presented as acultural and just human ways of learning. And it's not. It's decidedly a Eurocentric way of doing it. Nothing wrong with that. It only becomes problematic when you conflate Western Eurocentric ways of doing with human, because then everything else by definition is not human and not normal. Indigenous students know that. And they find a way to negotiate that from very early on, and that's not recognized. And when they don't do it, when Indigenous students openly rebel against the education system, they're thought of as problem students. And that often that gets lost in the mix is that the rebellion is a recognition of these competing identities. So the schools don't recognize that. They just see them as a problem. And there's no evidence of intelligence with that. So the other part of it, the other idea I want to bring up is this choice to openly identify with indigeneity poses problems within succeeding within Western educational systems, because the very lessons are developed and taught in the Western culture and have deeply embedded ideals that are readily at odds with many indigenous ways of being. So the example I often give is that I went away to a boarding school for high school. I moved from the small town of San Carlos, where I grew up with my grandma, grandpa, aunts, uncles, cousins, mom, dad. You know, like the joke was that I didn't have friends until I went to school because I just had cousins. Like that's what it was. Growing up in that scenario and then going away to Phoenix, which is the capital city, to a very large school where I was the only Apache person there and one of the very, very few Native folks there. I came to this understanding. First of all, I quickly understood that this is a very, very weird place. I was uncomfortable. I didn't want to be there, and I'll get to that part a little bit later on, but it was noticeably very uncomfortable. I was not at ease. I was not at rest. And it took me a long while to start to understand what some of these differences were. And in particular, the main thing that I often come away with and I talk about is that up to that point in my life, I was taught what it means to be an adult was when you're going to be able to help out your family and your community. That is a sign of an adult, is when you are able to give of yourself to your community or give yourself to others. When I went to high school, every lesson I took and everybody that was there understood the subtext that the sign of an adult is when you leave your family. Every lesson is built upon the presupposition that you want to be an individual, that you are doing these things for yourself, that knowledge is yours to take as the individual. And knowledge wasn't necessarily something that wouldn't be for you to a certain extent. So, for example, I don't identify as a woman, so I don't have woman knowledge. I'm not a medicine man. I don't have medicine man knowledge. That doesn't mean then that I should just be ignorant of those things, but rather what it means then is that I need to have relations with medicine people and women so that I can benefit from that knowledge. And I bring that up as an example in opposition to this idea that all knowledge is readily available for you to, as long as you just study hard, you can learn these things. And so that's a difference. That's readily at odds with many indigenous ways of being, and in this particular case, Apache ways of doing. The other thing I want to get at is this idea that academic grading is a means to enhance both Western and indigenous culture. Academic grading is not simply a replacement for a negation of Western education epistemology. Rather, the goal is to make a blend of both epistemologies and knowledge systems in order to succeed, to allow success. Current understandings of indigenous epistemology places it as a static entity, what I talk about feather and leather identity for indigeneity. Indigenous students may understand or at least feel indigenous knowledge systems are dynamic and modern. Indigenous epistemologies need to be built upon in order to give a full access of success for indigenous students within Western academies of education. This is the idea of sovereignty. This is the idea of nation building. Because if you don't acknowledge it, you don't recognize it, then it becomes something that is abnormal. And that identity, the idea between performance and performativity, you start to create indigenous students who recognize that their ways of knowing aren't allowed within schools, which then makes the student make a choice. Reject what they learn from their parents and their loved ones, and assimilate into these different ways of doing things, or engage in a constant imaginary battle that nobody appreciates or understands. So in all of this, though, there's these ideas within this idea of academic grading, there's allies too. And now I think this is a word that often gets pushed around too much, because I'm going to tell you this from my own personal opinion. I am more wary of allies than like the straight on people that are oppositional to my ways of talking about. Because allies will profess their allyship, but not necessarily understand, and they can. I've been stabbed in the back more by allies than those that weren't allies, and that's just how that is. And so, but because I'm a dreamer and I'm a really uplifting guy, I'm so positive, always looking on the bright side. It's also important to note that as academic grading is an active agency regarding resistance and resilience, Indigenous students may not respond to proclamations of good intentions. So I'm going to tell you how this all plays out for me in particular, as my role here at the University of Idaho. I teach from an Apache epistemology. I make sure that my education is co-constructed with the students. I assume that all folks are intelligent until they prove otherwise, and incongruences are due to access to different knowledge systems. And I actively subvert the power of the identity of the professor by decentralizing intelligence. That's just what I did from the class I came to. I also start looking at these other things, developing UI AIST programs. In particular, the development of their Tribal Elder Series, where we invite tribal elders to come teach at the University of Idaho for a whole semester, rather than what is commonly come over and talk for 1 hour. And we pay them as we would a visiting professor, even if they don't even have a bachelor's degree, because they're recognized by their communities as knowledge holders. And I also confront what I've called the idea of the Lorax, which is this idea that non-tribal folks within the realm of the university saying, well, I speak for the Indians because the Indians don't speak for themselves. And we're getting beyond that time where we have more Native professors and knowledge holders that are associated with the university. And also for myself, like I bring these things home. Like I'm not from here. As I'm telling you, like I recognize my identity as a visitor. I try to be a really good visitor. I try to do all that I can for the people that are from here. But my home is this beautiful place off to the right over here. That's where I'm from. And so what I do now is I'm working with San Carlos Apache College. I'm a regent over there. I help develop and define what education looks like for my home community. So these are some of the things that I engage in. So I kind of wanted to stop right there just to make sure I have enough time for discussion. I got a lot of other stuff to share too, but I wanted to leave it open for discussion. And if you don't talk, I can talk.
Thank you, Philip, for sharing all of that. I'm looking at my window and it is really interesting. I'm not even kidding. There's like an eagle that just landed on our tree. So that's really cool. But thank you for sharing. I hope we can open up for discussions. We just got done reading your woodcutters article. I of course have, lots of questions myself, but I want to open it up to our participants. And this is a really fortunate and great opportunity to have a discussion with you.
Yeah, and also just one really quick thing. Jessica told me that you read it, so I didn't. I do presentations also on the idea of Apache mathematics, but I figured that if you read it, then I don't want to be repetitive. I wanted to introduce some other aspects of these ideas.
We had a good discussion too on your article, so. Cool. Is there any questions?
Got a question. There's not going to be a short answer to this one, so I'm mostly just feeding that I'm curious about this and I'd like to know more about it. How do we do this right? How do we teach about so a context? I teach in the College of Natural Resources. I'm helping build an associate's degree in wildland, fields, and fire, and I'm building a class called Cultural Use of Fire. And I needed to build out the syllabus so that I could put it through the university general education curriculum so that it could count toward American diversity education requirements. So got through that piece, but I'm standing at the precipice of teaching this course and I'm like, I am not qualified to lead. Well, I'll say that I wouldn't consider myself a teacher of it. I'd be a facilitator of it, but you mentioned that your collaborators can sometimes be more dangerous. And I feel that. I feel like I could really easily slip into this category of like, oh, I read this book. I'm pretty sure I got it figured out. And so guidance, I'm open for guidance that you've got on how to approach being able to share in a partnership. How do we grow as a community appreciation for different ways of thinking and knowing while also not stomping on something by assuming we know?
I think for me, succinctly, it would be the recognition that there's other games in town.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that, so I purposely talk about it as a game. Because in general, the idea that in English, this idea of game is kind of associated with play, which is enjoyable to a certain extent. Because here comes the kid gloves. Because in my experience, the simple acknowledgement of the fact that what is being taught, what and how is being taught at the university is a very, very specific cultural way of doing and not simply a human way of doing. By simply recognizing that fact, feelings get hurt for a variety of different reasons. I'm not even saying that it's a good game or a bad game. I'm just saying there's other games in town. And that gets really problematic, especially when somebody says, no, this is the only game. This is the only way you teach. This is the only way you do it. This is how math looks. It looks like this. And unfortunately, as we all grow as humans and we start to recognize these other viewpoints and we're like, oh, there is knowledge there. I think of Shirley Bryce Heath. She did some research in the Piedmonts, in the Carolinas, and we're looking at these three different communities: a working class white, working class black, and then the town folk. The town folks were mainly the teachers. They were the ones that taught the classes. And in particular, she drew the attention to how questions were used to a certain extent and the differences with that. But also, another part of it was how those different communities used story, used definition of things. And the school kind of had a curriculum that had hierarchical understanding of, like, in order to learn, language skills, you have to start at this base level and you start building up to this other part. Well, it was this idea that the presupposition that you don't know anything and you come to the school to learn things. And part of that was this idea of docile bodies, that you had to be quiet, you had to sit, you had to listen, you had to do these things, and you had to repeat, you had to point out, where is the dog? There's the dog. What color is the ball? The ball is red. And so you had to play school. That was the first step. You had to understand the rules of that game. Play school. The first few years was learning the rules of how to play school. And a lot of the working class Black students didn't engage with that rules because they played with different rules. They played a different game. And what they came in with their language skills was something that wasn't taught until high school level. But because they were doing it out of sequence, they were treated as if they didn't know that. So I guess to your point and to your question on that, for me, it would be a simple recognition that there's other games in town. And also by default. And I might not know the rules of that game.
Yeah, that's my plan now is to approach it with the intent, the overall objective of the course is for people to recognize there are multiple ways to understand. And I'm not going to be able to teach you all the different ways to understand. I just want you to know that there's different ways to understand and that there's different results to those ways of understanding. And that's it. There's not one right, wrong. Like, do you like the results of this way of thinking about natural resources, or would you like different results? Trying to blow that up a little bit and then let them build that themselves, which because I don't have the tools to teach them all the ways to know and to use and recognize and appreciate fire. Other people do, but if I could get them at least opened to understanding and receiving information, I feel like that would be an accomplished objective.
I think also what might be useful, and obviously you're an intelligent person and you're free to choose whatever you want with this, but I think it would probably be pretty interesting and pretty useful if you were to preface everything as saying something along the lines of like, as a, whatever you identify as, I see it as.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
I have a quick question, if that's okay. I really like that as a statement. I struggle being in the department I am in many ways because nobody ever says as a. They usually say this is the way and this is not the way. Or I had a professor say measuring is not science, and that quote made me like my head explode because I was like, who are you to declare what science is and science isn't? But that comes out of frustration, but I wanted to like lead to something more positive, and I was just wondering if you could shed insight of ways to bridge that kind of because I don't know if they might consider themselves allies, right? But I in many ways I don't see them as allies, or at least they're definitely not comrades in like actively trying to deconstruct these ways of terror in many ways. But I was wondering if you knew ways, especially coming from as a graduate student, to like encourage these professors in our department to see the other ways of knowing.
Yeah, I'll tell you how I understand it. When I was in the thick of it, when I believed, when I still believed things, and I started to realize that things weren't what they seemed to be. I got really angry and mad and to a certain extent destructive. And luckily, I quickly understood that destructiveness, which I intended for others, was ultimately self-destructive. So for me, and this can be dangerous still, and this is a constant struggle, but for me, I do not I do not allow others to dictate my feelings to a certain extent. Really cynical. I insulate myself. I put up all these really destructive barriers that nobody can reach me, and I live there. That's obviously the danger. But I guess to a certain extent, while I am kind of joking, but I'm not really joking that I am an optimist. I kind of expect the worst and hope for the best. So I play a lot of baseball. I grew up playing a lot of baseball, and I know that for a good, effective baseball team, you need people with different skills. Like if you have a whole baseball team full of pitchers, you're probably not going to be hitting that well. And if you have a whole team of hitters, you're probably not going to be fielding that well. You need a mix. And so that allows me to interact with people that I really don't like on a daily basis. Because first of all, I think they're in a very different journey than me. They have very different objectives. But if I can manage to benefit from some of the things that they do well, then that's great. And I don't, once they start, like I try to stay out of their vision to a certain extent, because then they start analyzing what I do, and then they start telling me why I'm doing it wrong. And I'm like, oh, okay, let me leave you for a little bit. I'm going into the dugout. See you in a bit. So that, I don't know, that's kind of how I would approach that idea.
And just to make note, I also just got done reading a really awesome article that Dr. Stevens was a part of called Tribal Nation Building and the Role of Faculty, Paying the Debt on Indigenous Well-Being in Higher Education. I will put this in our Google Classroom, but there are some really great points that I think are relevant to the question that was just posed.
I have a question too, if I can go for it. So I think I'm thinking about what probably a lot of people are thinking about, and the question so far reflected this of like, how do we not fall into this like dangerous version of allyship, right? And I was thinking about a couple of different things like in the article and also things you talked about, where, you know, you're saying you're kind of positioning this argument within the article where it's like, you know, we're looking at math in these different ways, but like at the core of it, like there's this different ways to like do math, right? Which is like a similarity. But then you've also sort of talked about like working with, you know, working or creating coalitions with other groups, like, right, you're not a woman, you're not a medicine man, but you should be interacting with these groups, right? And so I think that like my question is about like a fundamental approach to like these relationships that we're trying to build. And so I guess, and I think I'm going to ask kind of like a binary question that I expect the answer is like not super binary. So just like get messy with it. But like, should we approach this as like an ethics of or a relationship based on similarity or difference? Like what's the, you know what I mean? Like that's, I'm not phrasing it fully, but it's like, are we approaching this as like we're different, or like there are these like core similarities, this like human, like you like kind of mentioned like a human way of looking at things. And I don't know, I want to wrap my head around it, and like I want to wrap my head around it in like the right way, you know?
Yeah. My opinion is I worry and I wonder if, well, let me tell you about colorblind ideology, and how destructive that is when instead of identifying those differences and acknowledging the differences, you say, well, no, we're really all the same. And then we kind of force people into images of our own self in our own cultural way of doing things. And that is problematic. That's what I would say is bad. Because I don't know you, I'm not like you. And that's not a negation of who you are. It's just a simple understanding that we're different. And that's, going back to the idea of the baseball analogy, I very well might need you on my team. But we need to allow that variability of those different skills to come to light. And we can't, going back again to when I was talking about how if I talk too much, that I'm smothering your imaginative capabilities. We need to be wary of smothering the imaginative capabilities of other people. And this really does strike at the heart of a lot of the pedagogical ways of doing here at the university. Because, so the thing about Western pedagogy is it's really good at time management. And so, like, the clock is a really big factor. What can we teach within 50 minutes or 75 minutes? And then we move on to the next one. My grandmother never said, okay, time's up. We got to move on and do math today. It just was all mixed into it. So I guess that, the point I'm trying to make is that acknowledging that there's different systems there, and again, that we might not be aware of what governs those different systems and what governs those different actions from different people. And so going back to your binary question of all the same or differences, it's very much differences. But we shouldn't be afraid of those differences.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
I have a question about, I've always struggled with the bell curve. I mean, it just seems like the bell curve is, I've never understood it. And as we look at differences more, can we tessellate that out into something else? I mean, it doesn't seem to fit what we're doing, but isn't that, as educators, what we kind of use as a standard? How is that going to, how are we going to look at the bell curve and still integrate all the wonderful things and openness we want to do?
Can you tell me a little bit more by what you mean by bell curve? I have an idea, but what do you mean by bell curve? I mean
the bell curve standard that, that they use on tests, and how I have never in my whole life been able to wrap my arms around the bell curve, that the population falls within a bell curve. I've had arguments since I was in high school about the bell curve. I've tried a J curve. I just don't think the bell curve's accurate, but nobody.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a lot of pushback on that. So where's your take on that? Because that drives a lot of education, especially in the K-12 system.
Yeah. It's a dangerous place. They smother you in that place. Yeah.
I do want to say one other thing. I love the Hallmark, don't get me wrong, but I refuse to let Hallmark run my life. Okay, so in terms of the calendar. But anyway, but the same thing is, how do we look at, they're using this standard and have for years, and they'll argue till the cows come home about the bell curve. So how do we transcend it?
I try to steer clear of those idiots.
Well, you got a lot of people to steer clear of. So, I mean, I fought it all my life. So what's the substitution?
If you don't mind, Philip, if I can say a few words. Yeah. So how I had mentioned earlier, going through the iKeep program, and Philip being a huge, part of that, and just supporting me as an Indigenous educator to celebrate my knowledge system, my community's knowledge system of, our Shoshone-Bannock ways of knowing. Kind of, I feel like all of these questions are related. And so if I hop back just a little bit, talking about, that there has to be this, we can't fall into this umbrella of diversity and saying that we see all our kids the same, that when we do that, we're also saying that because we see them all the same, we can't respond to the specific needs that they have within, in this case, the education system. And so we really have to honor our differences and our uniqueness that we bring into the classroom or learning spaces. And when we do that, there's been data now showing that our kids' learning, it gets better. They are able to engage in Eurocentric ways of knowing because they have a grounded understanding of their own Indigenous knowledge first. And then they are able to kind of connect the ideas. And actually, I think it's kind of funny when I'm building a curriculum as a teacher, because when I want to make a lesson on a cultural activity that's happening in my community, I have to tell myself, don't be too greedy, because all of these standards will fit in there. And I have to say, like, in kind of the same tone that Dr. Stevens is saying, like, I don't want to put too much where people won't believe me. I want to put just enough that it's like seems legit. But in fact, like, Indigenous ways of knowing are super rich. And that Buffalo curriculum lesson I talked about, like, we were able to put a bunch of things together. And I think bell-shaped curves, state standards, you know, my kids are going through state standards right now, and I know how smart they are. But they come home and in, you know, one day they're taking math and they feel like they're not smart. And then another day, you know, our kids are talking about us harvesting salmon, and my daughter, my 9-year-old daughter now, turned it into a math word problem. And she couldn't do that in the standardized test, but she can do that just talking and generating conversation with us. And so it's like how it's really us, like we have to be able to see beyond just this very small like keyhole of a way of measuring our kids' knowledge. And then just the idea of like really having to take to heart, you know, what's being discussed right now. I don't know how to be Apache, and I would probably be a terrible Apache person because I love talking to, you know, probably too much, and I like talking about my feelings, and I like having us share our feelings. I also, you know, I just think about how I'm connected to land here, and I don't know how I would fare where Philip's from. And so I don't try to assume that I'm gonna know how to be an Indigenous person in Philip's community. And the same thing, I wouldn't expect him to be an expert here, but that we have that relationship building and that it goes beyond just, it doesn't just have to be native to native or Indigenous person to Indigenous person, but it's really this whole community that we're building and, you know, doing our part and not being lazy.
Yeah, reflecting that, I take full advantage of white lady power with Vanessa. Like, oh my God, all the time. I'm like, white lady magic, do it now. And she does. It's great. I get to benefit from that. I was like, white lady magic, go to the bank. And so I do want to make sure this is something clear, because this is where sometimes people might not understand what it is that I'm doing. I purposely talk about analogies. I frame these things as analogies. Hopefully you're catching on that this whole thing of what I'm saying is an analogy for you, that you should not take this, what I'm saying as an Apache person, as the way to do things, but rather you having your own intellect, your own understanding to reformulate this and to make it useful for you. That's a key part. By no means am I advocating of just like Apache epistemology as the new colonization ways of doing things. No. And I think that again is the problem. So all that being said, you know, in regards to the idea of the bell curve, and when I say for myself, I steer clear of those idiots, I also am acknowledging that those idiots don't see themselves as idiots. And some of those people are very powerful. And I do need to contend with them.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for all of the great discussion. Thank you, Philip, for being here and spending time with us. And
Mhm.
I highly suggest if you have not taken a course from Dr. Stevens, you should. It'll very much challenge the way you see the world and grow. I also want to be mindful of time, and as we get ready for our next presenter. But Philip, if you could put your email maybe in the chat, and then if people have questions or want to meet up with you or have
Sure.
some cool projects going on, they can get a hold of you. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we will return with Dr. Sammy Matza Jr., and he's going to be talking about Indigenous research. So go get some water, stretch your legs, and we'll see you back in just a few.
I do.
Okay. All right, well, thank you all for hanging in there. Hopefully you were able to get some water and a snack. And we're going to go ahead and begin our next session. So we have Dr. Sammy Matza Jr. here with us. He is going to do an introduction. I think he does a really good job, so I won't say too much, but he will be presenting on Indigenous research methodologies and methods today. You want to go ahead, Sam?
Yeah, the boys are trying to jump into my screen just now. Gotta tell them go away.
Yeah. So
Um,
currently we're in our home and I'm in our office and Sam is in the living room. And so yeah.
Yeah, I
That's,
was
and
gonna do it
all our
from
kids
work,
are.
but people talk over. We've tried to do that before, and then people just talk over me, and you can't hear me. So
Yeah.
this works better. Let's see, share screen. PowerPoint. So you guys can see my PowerPoint. You can hear me.
Yes.
Now it should be in presentation mode.
We can see the notes on the bottom. Does that matter?
Yeah, hold on. I gotta switch it around. I can't remember how to do it.
I don't think it's in presentation mode, actually.
You might need to unshare, and then when you share their whole screen rather than
Oh,
just
okay.
presentation.
Right. Let's see. So you share that one. This one. This one.
Mm-mm.
And then at the top, there's an option for you to swap presentation screen. So now we're seeing the notes page. So if you can swap display up in the upper left.
So I'm seeing it in presentation mode.
Mhm.
So I just see my presentation.
Click escape, and you should be able to see.
Do stop share.
I'm gonna go check it out. I'll be right back. Oh yeah, that is weird.
So that's what I'm seeing. So hold on, let me do a share here real quick. I'll do it. So I just shared the PowerPoint. So I'm gonna do now a share this one,
Yeah,
desktop.
see how it, nope, so this is what it looks like.
Yeah. So I want to see this one. That's what you want to see.
You want to see the whole thing?
Yep, and then see share here. It just chose the wrong one. Gives you too many choices.
Okay. Are we good?
Yep, we're good. Looks
We're
great.
good. Okay. Okay, so the Indigenous Mentoring Program, the 2023 workshop, this is part 3 of 4. I'll be presenting today on Indigenous research methodologies and methods. Just here in these photos, kind of a looking forward into the presentation today. So there in your lower left is a map of contact with Shoshone Bannocks at time of European contact, and the places that we were occupying before state lines were drawn upon, where we kind of familiarize ourselves with today. And so you can see we're in all these neighboring states to Idaho. And then there on the right of that is a seasonal round. So I'll talk more about this as we go on, but just some ideas about where we should be in the Gregorian calendar through time, so space and time. And then that fits really well into talking about methodology, and that methodology there in the upper left. But more importantly in all of this is about being a scientist is having a process of healing, engaging in research, as we know it is the dirtiest word in Indigenous country and Indigenous people's language. Our use of the English language has been research, and so we definitely need processes of healing. So there on the right is a sketch of from a book talking a little bit about our Sundance ceremony, and myself hold that very dear to my heart as being a Sundancer. So advance the slide. Okay, so as I'm getting a little more comfortable with this today, just bear with me, please. This is a picture of my family. My wife, Jessica, she's moderating and hosting all this today and doing a wonderful job. These are our children. We're talking about our boys. Right there's Otakte on the right, and then our other son is on the far left. And then our girls are there in the middle, Malia and Abriana, and then our Ija dog, Smokey. And then there in the background is Mount Putnam on our reservation. So this is just a hillside up on the some Matsaw land, but also just a really good place to take a picture that we took this past winter, and just wanted to share that with everybody. So myself, I'm a grandfather, father, husband, extended family member here amongst the Shoshone Bannock tribes here in Fort Hall, Idaho, southeastern Idaho, on the Shoshone Bannock reservation. Also with Oglala Lakota tribes with my mother back in Pine Ridge, South Dakota and South Dakota. I Sundance and pipe carry with both of the tribes. I've been able to be a part of the ceremonies in both my mom and dad's tribes. And I have a PhD in water resources and science and management, master's degree in science, and a Bachelor of Science in Ecology. Co-founder of River with my wife. She'll talk about that some more today, but just part of our graduate work, we founded a nonprofit organization that we own and operate here from our reservation lands, getting our children out onto our homelands. We'll hear more about that later, so I don't want to share too much. And currently, as I was saying, I was going to be at work doing this, but as a research scientist for our Fish and Wildlife Department, lots of people in our office that like to visit in the background and tends to take over the conversation. All right, so a little background on me. So I wanted to share this as a publication, so Two-Eyed Seeing from Andrew Reed et al. In 2020, and just a Indigenous framework to transform fisheries research and management. So as I just talked about research and management and water resources and fisheries in particular, that's where I've been spending a lot of my career. So I really like this figure. I wanted to share with everybody, just that there's this idea about knowledge spaces and decision spaces. And in those knowledge spaces to decision spaces, things change from what we want to view and how we frame the science that we're viewing the world through. So currently the status quo is Western science, so WS. And then that is a very singular view, tends to talk about the world through a capital T truth. and that world is viewed through that lens only. There in the middle is knowledge assimilation. So we talk about Western science and this idea that there's assimilative or incorporating or integrating or merging indigenous knowledge with Western science, and you get this assimilated framework. And so those are some of the words that sort of get used in that, which still is in some ways still maintaining the status quo, that perception is still really prioritizing Western ways of knowing. What we're really trying to work towards is knowledge coexistence, so indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge on equal terms, and that there's a mutual perspective on the world, and then that perception as it goes into that decision space is shared and perceived through both lenses of indigenous knowledge and Western science. And I'll just say this right at the forefront, a lot of this gets marginalized or minimized very statistically in our statistics to very low success rates graduating from college in STEM degrees. And so there's lots of funding around this. Some of the stigmas that sort of come up in this idea is that we're viewed as a sort of a primitive state of human beings and sort of categorized as just a human species, part of the human species, and that we're just an earlier version of Euroman, and that's quite incorrect from the idea of who we are. We took a entirely different knowledge production route, and that'll start to become more clear as I share with you in this presentation about methodology, and I'll touch a little bit on this idea of indigenous knowledge. So I want to share this video with you.
California, Santa Cruz, researchers have uncovered a very skilled form of collaboration.
Hold on. So I want to share this video with you. It's on an automatic start. This is some National Science Foundation research that's been ongoing. It's about collaboration, and it's really interesting. So just pay attention here. And did you hear it? Did everybody hear it?
Yes, we heard it.
Okay, good. So if you need to, just turn up your computer or your PC or wherever you're at, and we'll get going again. All right, here we go.
In Indigenous family interactions, they can serve as a model for improving how people work together. This kind of collaboration involves truly thinking together. In today's globalized society, people need to think and work together to educate our youth, create sustainable political systems, and steward our natural environment.
Collaboration is foundational in many Indigenous communities of the Americas. Research with Indigenous elders, Mayan mothers, and Mexican children helps reveal how sophisticated collaboration works. We studied how Mayan mothers and their two small children engaged collaboratively by analyzing their interactions at a microscopic scale of fractions of seconds.
We examined Guatemalan Mayan and European American middle-class family interactions, focusing on the 10 seconds after each mother received a novel object to operate. This is the 10 seconds from one family. All of the Mayan families engaged smoothly together in harmonious concert, like a single organism with many limbs.
In our case graph, you see that the 20 Mayan families primarily engaged as an ensemble that included all three people. Among the European American middle-class families, such as smooth three-way interactions were rare. Instead, these families showed a different model of working together. They divided activity, separating from each other. Individual family members often did not engage with anybody else, or engage one-to-one, leaving one person out entirely, or even resisted each other.
It is remarkable that the Mayan families skillfully and smoothly engaged all together for almost all of the time. This was visible even at a microscopic scale, revealing the foundations of thinking together. Such collaborative practices have contributed to the endurance of Native American communities for centuries. Learning to collaborate in this way can help us address the issues that face us all. We need to collaborate to learn how to care for the natural, physical, and human world.
So that figure was showing, and I just want to be clear about that. The figures that were the larger bars from the indigenous communities were three-way interactions or more. And so when you have three-way interactions, that's what it's showing. And just like they showed in the video, there's cooperation that's happening and collaboration within the families.
At the University of California, Santa Cruz.
We'll move on. So aims of research and production of knowledges can differ because of this. And so what we see very early on in child rearing, as well as just a societal level, becomes a reflection in the aims of research for production of knowledges. And so in Western aims, what we see is really an aim towards proof and truth. And that makes a lot of sense as we go on to, and I'll organize this as we start to move forward towards the end. So we'll come back to this. In an Indigenous framework, what we're really looking at is meaning making and understanding, and this has a lot to do with collaboration. But more importantly, as you probably heard earlier in these sessions in the last couple of weeks, is that what we're really trying to understand in these trainings and these workshops and these exposures that we have is the understanding of border crossing, so that we're respective of whoever's culture or research that we're engaging in, and when we cross those borders, to be mindful of the customs and protocols of that given aim of research. So the purpose of traditional ecological knowledge, and I'm just setting this up for methodology, but this is really important because it also intersects with some really important theories in the sciences. So purpose one of TEK is to minimize negative impacts on species upon which human populations depended on for food and shelter and clothing, especially during periods of slow decline, which probably represent the majority of the time. Purpose two is to placate and protect the individuals who are most likely to survive the lean conditions and propagate their kind for the future. Purpose three, to make sure that the people are prepared and in position to take advantage of boom conditions while remaining cognizant of the role of environmental unpredictability on their non-human relatives and the potential impacts upon their own future survival and that of their kind. And so these are really overlaps in the theory of evolution. What sort of doesn't get well understood, and this is kind of a problem within science, is the interaction with human cultures and humans as an animal. So as I shared earlier, so those are the purposes of TEK, but from an indigenous standpoint, they look a little bit different than the theory of evolution, but very much related. In this figure, as I shared earlier, just a snapshot of some of the species and plants and animals that we were interacting with through time. And so as you see there in the center is a representation of time as we go into the winters and summers, and then across the equinoxes, both in the spring and the fall. And then this is overlaid with the Gregorian calendar, as I said earlier. But we also had names for those places because we named these places after the moon cycles, given in the cycles of the moon. But all the seasons were also greeted and welcomed with dances and songs, and those were also ways of acknowledging these plants and animals that would give their lives so that our lives may go on. And then again, this figure here about the data points of European contact, pre-reservation life. And again, these are just snapshots through time, or a snapshot in time, and is not a full representation of Shoshone-Bannock use of the land in places where we were at, because we were also in Nevada. And so this is just a point of in time. What stands out probably to most of you as well when you look at this is you see a lot of those data points are along waterways, and that's important. Lots of cultures around the world tend to want to live along waterways, given that we are majority made up of water. So as a terrestrial being, we need water, and this is very important to our existence. And so not that much different for Shoshone-Bannocks, but much more localized given our languages and our customs and protocols. So taken together, this gives us an idea, really good idea from Kyle Powell-White, he's a scholar at a University of Michigan, wrote a book chapter on time as kinship. So even seeing time as kinship, so when we talk about tradition and traditional ecological knowledge is really going back to those places over and over again, so that actually our interactions with place, plants and animals has an evolutionary trajectory. And that's not lost on the idea that a lot of the human causes of what's happening in the world is causing biodiversity loss, has a great effect on the processes of evolution. So those are kind of these big picture things about where we are in space and time. These are really important things for scope and scale for scientists, about where our study sites are, what our study interests are, and how we narrow that down to a study that we're going to do for whatever reason towards the aims of the research I shared earlier. But as we go forward, I'm going to start to build on methodology now. So we're going to deal with some these words about like axiology. And so what we value. So basically, like, what are our values? What kinds of things have value? And so for us, I want to come to this excerpt from Critical Indigenous Research Methodologies and Brian Brayboy et al. That was published, I think, in 2012 or something. I can't remember now. I'm forgetting. Anyway, so in there was these 4 R's, and the relationality, responsibility, respect, and reciprocity. Responsibility can't be said without the idea of accountability as well. And so through that, through our ceremonies, as I mentioned earlier, we practice these and are reinforced in the sweat lodge. A related part of our ceremonies as well is the Sundance. So I talked about being a Sundancer. So there you see all these ropes tied to the tree. Cottonwood trees are usually in aquatic areas or streams, floodplains. They need lots of water, and so they're full of water. And so when we cut them down, water actually starts pouring out of them. And when we carry them, they're very heavy because water is just really heavy. And so as a collaborative activity to bring all the Sundancers into the Sundance, we raise this tree, and we cut it down and we carry it to the Sundance grounds, and then we raise this tree in the middle. And that takes a lot of coordination. And one of the things shared with us is to have one heart and one mind to do that. And so that's sort of our protocols and our customs, and these are the things we practice. What we live outside of that, though, in American society is traits of individualism. And that, has a lot to do with self-sufficiency, uniqueness, autonomy, and independence. And given those, we wouldn't be able to raise a cottonwood tree in the middle of a Sundance ground. And although usually the audiences that are attending these don't necessarily agree with this, so this is really a generality, is just this pursuit of net worth or status, or both. And that tends to drown out a lot of things that we need to talk about in these conversations about collaboration and cooperation, and becomes a really positive or negative feedback loop, however you want to look at that. So next big word is epistemology, and really just having like origins of our knowledge or stem of our knowledge, like what's the roots of our knowledge, the nature, origin, scope, and rationality. So for us, there's a really good storybook by one of our elders, Donna Houts MacArthur. And in those stories, one of the central characters is Coyote. And then he talks a lot about our origins as Shoshone-Bannock people and teaches us lots of lessons. But we have a common story across Turtle Island about our creation, and that has to do with the beaver, the muskrat, and the otter. And in most cases, it really talks about a woman too, who really brings forth life onto Turtle Island, or AKA North America. Conversely, we tend to learn outside of our practices, we tend to learn a lot about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle in the university or in high school, if you're get that early on teaching. Much of this knowledge that's passed on through Western ways is really passed on from human being to human being to human being. And so very anthropocentric sort of viewpoint of epistemology. Our epistemologies that I mentioned earlier is just plants and animals, and we learn from them, the land and the waterways. But I want to make a distinction here that there's a separation of nature that also plays out in this. And so very early on in European history and knowledge production, this was carried on through even the recent philosophy of or philosophers. But before them was this early idea about Pan, the god of the forest, and this idea that there was a separation of people from nature and a fear of nature. And so Pan is as a god of the forest, really viewed and carried on through the base word for panic, in that fear-based response to things that we panic about. And so those ideas about embracing nature in different ways is some of the issues that are going on that give different values and perspective on wanting to hear and learn more about Indigenous knowledge and methodologies. And this is really important because when we talk about our origin stories, when we talk about Coyote, we talk about Coyote in his fish basket. In this fish basket, this old woman, she's telling him to be careful around her fish basket because she's going to spill her fish basket and all her fish are going to fall back into the water. And she took a long time to catch them. And here in southeastern Idaho, Shoshone-Bannock homelands, this is our story of our origins and our place in land. So he spills the water over, and then the fish fall out, and then they fall out of the basket and they go down the Snake River, and then he builds these rock weirs that turn into these waterfalls today that we know as Idaho Falls, American Falls, and then Twin Falls and Shoshone Falls. And given that, he hold on, I need to pause for a second real quick. So I'm gonna.
You're still on mute.
Yeah, I'm trying to back up now. So in that story, so those falls are made, and he's trying to make these dams, and he makes these waterfalls. And so in that story, and this is a story told to us by Diane Yoop, and she recently passed away, but she would tell us these stories, and some of our elders as well growing up, and just the idea that so when we talk about the fish basket is really the caldera of Yellowstone, and that's that map there in the middle, or that view from above, the topographic map. And the idea of the caldera is the fish basket, and the woman that's talking to Coyote is Mother Earth, and Coyote is phenomena, and he as this caldera filled up with water, it eventually broke over and all the fish fell out into the headwaters of the Missouri River drainage as well as into the Snake River. And so we can relate our origin stories and our creation stories back to theories of evolution or science, and they're not far off from one another. And they can evolve with it. Even in the 21st century, we can still talk about these things, given all the knowledge we have now about tectonic plates and how things move. So this is really important about epistemology that I wanted to point out about our stories and how important they are. So ontology is this is the third big word. So we've gone through axiology, epistemology. We're doing this pretty quick, but just bear with me. So ontology is the nature of being, relationality of reality, self, and what it means to be who we are. All of these kind of have their little bit different variations of their definitions, but we'll just stick with the ones we're using today. In ontology, though, one of the things that stood out to me and really helped me was Viola Cordova in her book on Native American philosophy. And in the table of contents, she really talks about, and this really helped with my identity as a scientist. She talks about bridges, so her own stories about the bridges of the cultures that she comes from, and then windows, so how she perceives the world given those cultures, and then what is the world, so what is she seeing outside those windows, and then what is it to be human, so what is her role as a human, what is our role as a human, and then what is the role of a human in the world. And so taking all those together, like what's going on there. One of the things I want to point out from this that stood out for me as in this idea of ontology is linguistics and etymology and origins of words. And so I don't take words, especially English words, as a for granted as someone who holds lots of educational background in academia. Entomology is really important, and we tend to take our cultures for granted, or even the origins of our words and how we're using them or misusing them. And so I just want to stay with this for a second and kind of get to this idea about verbs and nouns. So nouns are, the English language has thousands of nouns and less than 1,000 verbs. Conversely, in Indigenous language and Shoshone-Bannock languages, we have thousands of verbs and less than 1,000 nouns. And so that sets us up for these two different thought worlds. And so we talk about language as window. From Viola Cordova's perspective, she talks about there may be concepts in Indigenous worldviews that are a verb thought world that may not be translatable into a noun thought world. And so there are some differences that come up between languages. So linguistics as a reflection of the cognitive processes explaining this existence or ontology, our beingness. I want to use an example of my own here. So in this cultural linguistic paper about treaty language that I wrote with a couple of law professors there at U of I, we have this section here that I want to explicitly talk about. So Lakota is really specific in terms of the describing of different processes. For instance, chlecha, which means the idea to tear. If you tear something with your fingers, it's yuchlecha. If you tear something with your teeth, yachlecha. If you tear something with pressure, pachlecha. If you tear something with your foot, nachlecha. If the wind blows and tears something, it's wochlecha. And it goes on. There's more than this, but I'm just trying to emphasize the fact that Lakota language offers a different perspective, a different angle on the world we live in. So I use this as a perspective from one of the language speakers in my mom's language, and it's a video just trying to promote language speaking and teachings. And I thought this was a really good example to use because in ecology, we talk about ecosystems that are really complex, and they have these diagrams that have these nodes, and then these nodes are connected with these lines, and they'll talk about like food networks or ecological networks where species are related. And what happens in that is a real focus on those nodes. But what's in between the nodes is what this example is talking about. So our interest is more about the verb or the tearing or the action of what's happening. And so this is the different idea of these different this is the idea of the different worldviews and perspectives about and language as a reflection of that. So taking all that together, this is a background of a old photo from our Shoshone-Bannock ancestors, and I just watermarked this idea of methodology with this. So Shoshone-Bannock methodology. So axiology, we went through that: respect, reciprocity, relationality, responsibility, and accountability. And then epistemology that we learned from our lands, waterways, plants, and animals. And then ontology is a verb-based languages in motion, so like Tsotsoni or Banakwa. So we kind of say those a little differently in our own way. But taken together, this is really the framework we need as Indigenous cultures and peoples, as Shoshone-Bannocks, that is different from Western ways. So usually in Western science, though, a lot of Western scientists, even faculty, academics, don't really have a sense of methodology until we start to talk about this explicitly. And so this is really an implicit thing. It's very invisible in becoming a scientist. And so that's where the difficulty comes from someone like myself in trying to become a scientist, as methodology is not taught. And so we don't see the differences and don't ask questions, and it's not a critical analysis of how to form our own methodology. And so, but with that, what really happens from this is that we can get really excited about methods. So method choice is interesting because some of the methods, as I was becoming a scientist, I would disagree with, and I was like, but why? And so the big why is answered with methodology. And so when you have methodology, our choosing of methods, tools, applications, technologies, etc., becomes much clearer and evolved methods of our own because we understand our own methodology. And so that method use it's really clear. Why do we want these things? Why do we want these certain methods? And it really helps us free up our minds so we can start to really focus on experimental design and study plans, research agendas. These are really important ways for us to start to move forward that way. So this is kind of what we shared today so far. I sort of set it up a little bit with the purposes of TEK and the importance of collaboration, and then the different aims of knowledge. And as I said, I wanted to bring them together. And so bringing them together is these different thought worlds. And so as we bring these together, what I've shared with you, take to kind of put it together now is the noun thought world. So in a noun thought world, it's a lot of, you set a noun up with another noun, and these two things are the opposite of one another. Usually what happens is in this sort of thought world is these become competition or versus one another. In the verb thought world, what happens when you have these nouns and you're more focused on what's connecting them is this idea of collaboration or cooperation. And as we shared earlier in that video, this idea of collaboration is very early on in our teachings from childhood into adulthood. And so this is the idea where proof and truth matters, and meaning making and understanding. And so in the proof and truth, when you're in competition, there's winners and there's losers. So you got to prove who's the winner, who's the loser through this truth you're in the pursuit of. In the verb thought world, when we were talking about Indigenous communities, Shoshone-Bannock communities, we're talking about this idea of collaboration and cooperation. We're not going anywhere. We don't need to compete. We are here at home. We feel safe here. We had lots of resources. People referred to this place as many times over as a Garden of Eden. That wasn't on mistake. That was very purposeful. And that was a result of meaning making and understanding, meaning making with relatives beyond human beings as well, and understanding of plants and animals. So that's kind of my little spiel today. I kind of had a quick sort of overview of something that I share is much longer, but shortening it today given the parameters of today's presentation. So I hope it's enough that we can start to engage in some really rich back and forth through some Q&A here. So that's it for me, Jessica. You can take it away. I'm going to stop sharing and
Awesome. You did so good on time. Good job. I was like trying to rearrange things in my head.
Yeah.
I am going to pin you. And
You're
then
like, a lot. You're going to go over.
No, I was just like, maybe I don't need to present. Maybe. Yeah, let's open it up to discussions. We have about 15 minutes. My husband and partner in life is very knowledgeable and really great at facilitating conversation and sharing. So please feel free to ask questions.
I have a question. If I can ask a question. I'm really taken with this idea that methodology is really implicit normally. And so, Sammy, when you're because I know that you collaborate with different fisheries folks and other scientists, how do you kind of begin these conversations of making the implicit explicit, right? And I imagine that it starts at the experiment design stage, but
yeah,
how do you navigate that when, I guess, at that stage, but then also later on, right? When you're not at the experiment design stage and you're trying to get people to think about like thought worlds and language, which can be, it can feel like regressive in later stages of an experiment, right? Because it feels like a big step back. So can you talk about how these conversations tend to develop and what best practices for developing these conversations?
Yeah, so I think Jessica, she may have shared this already, but if she didn't, so our daughter is she's been in our language school since kindergarten, and she's about 4 years now. She's 8 years old. She's going to be 9, but we let her know that she's teaching us and that we're learning from her. And as a young person who's teaching her parents how to speak the language, there can be some ways to think about how we need to engage with people as well. Like we can look at an advisor or mentor, and approaching them, excuse me, approaching them so that you don't expect them to be a know-it-all, and try to have an expectation that they are really need introduction into these things. And so trying to say that, you know, it's not your, so this is, it's already been places of conflict where I've had to come back to these and have conversations about, it's not about blaming, and it's not about someone's fault for doing something, making a mistake, about misstepping into this border crossing. And what is really happening is that we have this public education system that we've, even for I have an advisor who was who grew up in Canada, and so even his public education system didn't afford him the ability to really understand these deeper nuances of like, whose lands am I living on, who's my neighbor, what is their way of thinking, and so we try to unpack that in a way. I think that the approach is really being very humble and lots of humility, and I get a lot of these practices from Jess, is just saying we and us a lot, and this is our, you know, we're doing this together, and I think that can be really helpful to setting up a different kind of conversation. That's you're trying to really not engage in conflict as a competition, but rather conflict as cooperation, and that although that's something different, and it feels different, is that you really have to pause for a second and take time and check in on feelings. And that's a big step for people to check in on feelings, and it can be a bit of a practice just to engage in initially. You want to raise your hand for?
Yeah, sorry, I was just thinking a story that you share, I think that would be helpful, is the idea of night fishing. If you want to.
Oh yeah. Well, I think that's we could come back to that, but I just sort of think that humility is really important. And yeah, if there's any other questions, I don't want to take up too much time. If there is not, then I could share the night fishing story.
Hear it. There's night fishing story.
Oh, okay.
I hear it.
All right. So my advisor, I think we got along pretty well, but there was still tension here and there. And then I graduated, and so now we're colleagues. And he was working on this project to collect some fish, and he's a fish ecologist, and he was over collecting some fish for some data that he was collecting. And then he was out night fishing with a headlamp and a little like aquarium net to catch young of the year fish. And he ended up coming through this side of Idaho back to U of I, and he stopped in, and he said, just, you know, was visiting, catching up, and he says, oh, and I said, well, what are you doing over here? And he said, no, collecting just what I just told you. And in so many ways, he said that he was collecting fish with those little fish net at night. He says, they're so easy to catch at night. And he said, you know, fish, they're using the water way differently. And so they just come out from under the banks, and they're swimming in the middle of the stream. And he goes, and they're so easy to catch at night with a headlamp. He's like, I didn't even have to use an electrofisher. So usually electrofishers, traditionally ecologists more recently will use these electrofishers. So they'll electrocute the stream with this wand and this tail, and it puts a charge. It's basically like tasing fish. And then you net them up because they're like unconscious. But he was like, oh, I didn't have to use that. I just use this little net and the headlamp at night. And he's like, so it's this really great finding that he's talking about, and he's talking about it in this way that it's like this innovation. And he's like, I heard you kind of talk about this before. He goes, but if you wanted to talk about it some more, maybe we could develop a method and publish it. And I was like, I wasn't real too interested in it. And I was just kind of like, yeah. I was like, yeah, we've done that since time immemorial. And one of the things that we do is, Lewis and Clark documented this, is like, we put these lanterns out at night and we hunt salmon that way. And it's very much the same, very similar practice. So fish don't see a predator in the sky. They come out from under the banks. It's nighttime. They move around. They'll move up and down the streams. And this night fishing and using a spear is really effective at night. And anyway, so it wasn't necessarily a new finding and not necessarily something I felt like needs to be published. And so it was a little off-putting, but still trying to be having some humility in it and just, letting them know I wasn't interested. But that has a lot to do with Indigenous knowledge. So yeah, it was just a little story.
A good one.
Yeah.
I have a question from that story, actually, that I thought was, so does that happen often? Like this moment of like, unless I'm misunderstanding kind of what you're saying in the end, like saying, I don't think that needs to be like contained in like an official research capacity. Like, do you ever see like, is that something you see often where it's like, actually it's more dangerous to try to wrangle it within that type of framework? Maybe we should just leave that one alone.
Yeah. So the thing about research that I mentioned earlier as the dirtiest word in Indigenous language or use of languages research, and yeah, it's so what you're talking about or asking about is this idea about universalizing knowledge is really what happens in science. And this is really a vehicle of colonialism. Like, this is why people left their lands and went to other lands. And this universalizing knowledge and even the use of English as a language is really a process of delocalizing knowledge. And the tribes may not know explicitly like exactly what's going on there, but they definitely get the sense of the feeling when knowledge is being delocalized. And so we're not in the business of delocalizing knowledge. And so you'll see elders, you'll see community members, they'll either get upset about it or they'll disengage, and or variations of that. But that disengagement and the getting upset is a red flag for us. To delocalize our knowledge and try to apply it universally, that we need to apply this make this available for everybody across all cultures is not the problem. It's not what we're interested in. So when he was saying that, I have a little bit of concern. Not that I don't want to be engaged. I think it's important because you're not using an electrofisher as a way to interrogate fish. I just think interrogating fish overall is a problem. And so we might come back around to it, but for now, I just thought at the time I was like, it's nothing new. It's something. I think that's the part that he was sort of disengaging with, is that I was like, yeah, it's nothing new. It's something we've been doing for centuries. So yeah, given that, I just think there should be some caution about universalizing knowledge and delocalizing it.
And excuse me, just to tie into the previous readings, there's a section about not all knowledge is meant to be shared. And when we're working with tribal communities, having those relationships, you understand what is shareable and what's not. Any other questions? I think we have time for one more. All right, I have a question. So how do you see your professional background and working with within the space of education and the work that we do? How do you see them benefiting each other?
So one of the things is the tribes don't have a lot of, like I was saying earlier, we don't have a lot of success in STEM fields. There's lots of funding for that, but those avenues of funding tend to come in and they want to get these metrics around just kids doing whatever STEM activity it is and take some pictures, and then they leave and they get numbers. And that's not helpful. And it's definitely not helpful when a lot of these different objectives or the type of science they're teaching isn't based in our culture, in our way of life. And so you'll see this become very messy. And the thing that our young people need to understand about being a scientist, first and foremost, is that it takes a lot of organization skills. And if you're engaging in something that looks messy and the expectation is messy to be organized, then the problem is already set up right in the beginning, is that, well, there's all this messiness going on. Why do you expect me to be organized? And so right at the forefront, that cultural competency for our young people and the people that are coming out into our communities is really difficult. And so some of the work we're doing is engaging in that organization and trying to share that and share it in a way. So Jessica's going to share about River Nua today. And that practice of packing on and off the river really gives a sense about what it would mean to be a person moving across our homelands through that seasonal round, and what it feels like to pack up your camp every day and then move and then unpack it at night, make dinner, like that movement across land. And like so that takes a really high amount of organization and thoughtfulness to really think about what's your next 2 or 3 steps in order for you to first and foremost remain safe and do things safely, but also to just make sense out of like how you're using your time and kind of being a little more efficient at getting on and off the raft and unpacking and packing up your camp. And so that kind of movement really starts to situate how they want to learn, how language should start to adhere to those living practices, and then starting to step into these ideas about methodology and this type of science and what's important as aims of science for our young people as they start to grow up and graduate high school and go into college. So we're just trying to, incrementally build these steps in a 21st century model about how we do both at the same time, and how we are doing those within an idea of cooperation and not competition. And so, I think we think about a lot of things and we try to do it all at once, and sometimes that works out pretty well, and sometimes we have to let go too and just let it be what it's going to be, because sometimes our young people they already get it and they're really smart, and they'll start leading us through it, and that's pretty awesome too. And I really enjoy that, seeing that for real, not just reading it in a research paper, but seeing it for real. Very, very inspirational.
Yes. So if there's no more questions, I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Sami Matsaw Jr. For taking time in your day to visiting with us and advising. And Sam is also someone who is, very personable and very good at just being a resource for good conversation, especially in the world of sciences and the hard sciences too. So thank you. I think we're going to go right into sorry, Sam, if you can put your email in the chat too, so that way if anyone wants to send questions or things like that, they can get a hold of you. But we're going to go right into the film showing. It's 27 minutes long. And if you haven't seen it, it's called River of Return, and it talks about the work we do and the educational outreach with our nonprofit River Nua. And then I'm going to do a quick presentation and try to leave time open for discussion. So if you want to go ahead, Sean, and take it away. I think your screen is still on, Sam. Or if you might still be pinned. Hold on. Nope. Just gotta mute it. This place is all the things I want for my kids. all the things I want for the young people of my tribe. This place is medicine. This place is my home. It's my mama. It's my heart.
Nananiha Sammy Matsa. My name is Sammy Matsa. Me and my wife, Jessica.
We are taking our community, our tribal members, our tribal youth onto the river of the Middle Fork of the Salmon.
The Middle Fork is really ideal for these trips. There's no fences, there's no roads, there's very little to any fragmentation or disconnection of habitat. And I didn't see this growing up. A lot of the adults here on the reservation haven't seen it. A lot of the youth haven't seen it. My wife didn't see the Middle Fork until she was adult. And so I think what we're offering isn't just a free trip on the river, but actually a great opportunity to reconnect to a really special place to us.
For these trips, we're doing a lot of things. Tate, Luzaha, Eli, Fisher, Warren, time for class. Kids, Gimai. We're gonna play a game. These are our agay. So what is agay? Salmon. I'm gonna roll them, and you're gonna try to throw your spear through the hoop. So we're learning how to hunt and fish. This is helping with hand-eye coordination. So which one is gonna be harder to get through? Yes. Do we got that? Thumbs up? Yes? All right. We ready? Here we go.
We, as Shoshone Bannock tribal members, we've wanted to do something that moves us forward. So we've been building this curriculum for our river school.
Ooh, that was so cool.
We're using science, technology, engineering, education, art, and mathematics. And most important, we bring our culture into it as well. But there's many aspects.
It's a trip where we can feel safe to laugh together, to challenge each other. And I really love being here because it's a time we can calm down and fish and just watch the kids play and just really celebrate as a community. Like I can imagine that that's how it was in the past, in how things used to be. I feel like Sam and I have been together for not just this life, but we've been together before. Sometimes he needs help talking through his feelings. And I feel like that's where I can help him.
So Jessica, she's this old spirit who's all about her emotions. She will tell you how she feels about something, and she will acknowledge your feelings, and she will get you to talk through those feelings and get you to understand where you're at, whether you like it or not.
He's really smart. He knows a lot of things about a lot of things.
She's so powerful, and I just love her so much.
He's been with me at my very lowest when I felt broken. He made me not be ashamed of those things. He helps me to see my own strength.
I just think she's the most beautiful person, and he takes care of me and protects me. And I love her for that every day. She's this wonderful human being who's helped in my healing. And both of us are still going through a process of healing.
Before Sam and I were married, I was in a violent relationship, and that man tried to murder me.
I was deployed into Iraq as an infantryman with IEDs and RPGs and small arms fire. We both know what it means to risk our lives and have our lives before us and think that we're not going to live much longer. As Native Americans, what we're going through as an Indian or an Indigenous person, that's just full of challenge. Jess and I, we have our own personal stories, but as a tribe, we have this really ugly past. Just over 100 years ago, our ancestors were removed from this place, from the middle fork of the Salmon River. Trying to reconcile that for me starts out as a really sad feeling, and a feeling of loss, and a feeling of disconnection from all of the things that when those people left over 100 years ago, all the things that they probably wanted to teach the next generation, that they were used to teaching the next generation. So that disconnect very literally from who we are today to who we were then, and then trying to come back to that. We're working towards this challenge. And that, in many ways, is what these trips are all about.
There's this campsite. I look forward to it every year. And we do our traditional foods night. And I really love being here because there's these mussels. We go in the water and gather them. And I can't see them, but I just feel for them and talk to them. I let them know that we're here and that we're really happy to see them. I call these guys grandpas because they're pretty old, some of them. You know, the really big ones that fit in your hand, they're like 100 years old. And so these guys are probably like, I could guess they're about 80 years old, and they've seen a lot. And I like to think that their ancestors knew my ancestors and that we're reconnecting again. They're really beautiful. I'm gonna clean them here in a little bit. I'll ask my girls to help me. I think they're saying, hey, where have you been? We've been waiting for you. We missed you. I'm so excited I bit my lip.
Oh.
They're my favorite.
You miss it?
For our tribal youth, we've noticed that there's this theme going on. When we first get going on the river, they seem uneasy, and they seem to be afraid of the river. And maybe this is because they've never known a world without constraints. Back on the Fort Hall Indian Reservation, they see potato fields, wheat fields, they see canals, ditches, roads, highways, dams, and are sometimes living in the deficit statistics that are reported about Native American people. We have high substance abuse, suicide rates, obesity, diabetes. And so it's really hard for them to imagine what the world looks like when it isn't fragmented and disconnected. And so I think for them to see this unrestricted landscape really frees them. And after a couple days, they start to ease into it, and they start to realize where they're at, and they start to realize the freedom that they have and their own identity on that landscape. And they start to feel their own self coming free from what they feel from on the reservation.
This whole river is so spiritual. I love this place. And it has a lot of meaning.
When we stop at cultural sites, I realize that those places are very important to how we used geography, how we used mathematics, science, technology, and how we were teaching and learning that throughout the year. And I think about how my ancestors would have used the land to get water and to get food and to hunt and to fish and to gather. And so I think really deeply about our language and the culture and what it means to revitalize that and bring it back to life.
It's just such a powerful place to be somewhere that your ancestors were at, that you could see how they live and experience what our people are capable of. That's why I say I think that when you go down the Middle Fork, it's almost like you're calling your spirit back to you. That maybe that's the part of you that needed to be taken care of.
everyone gather over here.
Takte, Malia, Anna. So find your name and where you're sitting. Okay, find your spot, find your spot.
Mom, I didn't get cake.
Nobody got cake yet, okay? Okay, here we go. There's this transformation that happens, like every day going down the river. We see it in drum making, in drawing, when we're painting, during science class,
These are real big.
and during math lessons. Tate, where's the radius at?
The middle.
Yes, good job. I just see their confidence building in who they are. I see them coming out of their shell or coming out of this uncertainty and starting to just show us who they are and showing themselves who they are too. I just know that a lot of beautiful things happen when we're on the river together.
The last evening that we're on the river, we've been noticing our youth saying, okay, this is who I am. These are my homelands. This is my identity. I feel free, and this is my home. This is where I want to stay, and they don't want to leave the river. Their transformation that they go through is really impressive for the week that we're on the river. Within the 7 days we're here.
I'd like everyone to stand and dance. Try to get in the circle. The way this one goes is that you double time it. So I'll dance with you guys. Saiboya, 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 Saiboya. Yaro yagara mando yara mando wegwandora. Biaro yagara mando yara mando wegwandora. Saiboya, 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 Saiboya. Biaro yagara mando yara mando wegwandora. Yara yagara mando yara mando wigwindora. My pants. Yara yagara mando yara mando wigwindora. I want to thank all of you, and I hope some of you keep that dance and keep some of the songs in your heart. Thank you very much.
We had a lot of really great learning moments happening along the river, and I have a memory and a thank you and deep appreciation to every single one of you. And so the fact that you all gave us your trust to get you down the river means a lot to us. The trust of my family to bring my siblings down the river means a lot to me.
Honestly, don't know what to say. 'Cause outside of this place, I have had no real life. But when I come here, I have no life other than to be with you guys. It's just thank you all for letting me sing and share my heart with you guys. 'Cause when I go home, I'm not gonna have the last same laughter that I have with you guys. I'm not gonna have the same joy as when I'm hanging on for dear life with Sterling. But right here on this river holds my heart, and this river is my heart's home, and I want to thank you all.
want to let you all know that you're wonderful and you're smart, hard workers. This is gonna make me cry. I'm just so proud of you, all of you, that you're mathematicians, and we've always been mathematicians, and I just love you guys a lot, all of you.
We love you guys.
We do.
Thank you for being here.
So when I see you off the river, I'm still Auntie Jess, okay? All right. And Mom. And sister. All right. Thank you. I get a little bit emotional because, like, we need each other, and when we're missing that part about our identity, or we're missing that connection that we used to have, then we're not whole people. And when we start to facilitate just having that love again, it makes me excited, not just for myself, but my kids. It goes beyond me. It goes, my grandkids are gonna know about these relatives and this river, and I don't know what the feeling is called, but I know that in order to ensure that my family is taken care of, I need to do this. So.
People remember heartwarming ads. So to help you remember that Liberty Mutual customizes your home insurance, here's a touch.
All right, so that was about we got to the end of the film, so I'm just gonna go ahead and jump right in. Thank you all for taking the time to watch that. It's on YouTube, so we found that it's also been a helpful tool to include in classrooms. And so we have it as a free resource. I probably need to unpin Sam. Hold on really quick. Oh no, he's not pinned. But I'm just gonna go ahead and jump into screen sharing as we're getting to the end of our time together. I always feel like it goes so fast. Right. So you guys just got done watching a video about a nonprofit my husband and I co-founded called River Nua. I'm gonna share a bit about what River Nua is and how we see learning together through intergenerational and land-based pedagogy. So kind of giving an example of situating myself as a researcher and something that we have talked about in previous sessions. So this is, all the parts of me that influence who I am as a researcher. And you can probably tell both Sam and I really, this is probably our favorite photo. So, I also have it on my slides. But I grew up in Fort Hall, Idaho. I also grew up part of my life in Molokai, Hawaii. I feel like both places have influenced who I am. I have a master's in education and curriculum instruction, plus my 2 teaching certificates through the Idaho. I am a former I am an alumni of the U of I Keep program. I have experience teaching Head Start, K through 12, and recently higher ed. I am a high school teacher, currently teaching in tribal high schools. I am also pursuing my PhD in education at U of I, looking at Indian education reform and land pedagogy. And at the center of all these things is I am a mother and a wife and Shoshone Bannock, and I feel like those situate me in really understanding who I am and how I pursue my inquiries. And I'm just going to stop sharing really quick. I don't know if I am off mute. Okay, I am. I just wanted to make sure. Sorry. Okay. So I like to, situate us and remind us, like, why are we coming together for these kinds of conversations, particularly my expertise in education. And so we need to remember, in the past, historically, the underlying ideology of American nation building motivated educational reformers in the push for civilization. And so it was the idea that Native Americans across Turtle Island were not civilized and we were not able to care or think for ourselves, and we were less than human. Honestly believing in the rightness of their cause, Indian reformers argued that not only would education save American Indians from certain extinction, but that the most effective means to ensure their salvation was the off-reservation boarding schools. And so this is a part of history that has impacted many Indigenous communities. Our community is also part of that era of boarding schools. My grandfather was someone in our family who went to boarding school, and it was pretty terrible that he ran away to join the military and go right into World War II, lied about his age. He was only 15. And just to get away from boarding schools here. This is something pretty close to home. So River Nua, how we started, and I think the film did a really good capturing on how Sam and myself, our life experiences have really led us to wanting to try to participate in change within our community to address social issues. I myself am a third generation survivor of domestic abuse. I've seen issues of violence happening within my home, within my community, and very like tribal communities, Indian Nation. And I was just like pretty upset, like why were these things happening at such a high rate compared to other demographics? And interestingly, it led me down this road of looking at education. The same thing for my husband. In the film, he talks about his life experiences and having PTSD. And I don't want to speak too much to his perspective because it's his own. There's more elaborate, I guess, like our perspectives on our website that you'll be able to see later on if you choose to. But essentially, we had life experiences and we wanted to try to address issues that social justice through our educations and research. And River Nua was born from that. So River Nua is a community-driven mission. I got a little emotional when we were watching the film. Sam had mentioned earlier about Diane Yupnop, and she very recently passed away. And so it's bittersweet to see her in our films, and she was very influential and impacted us greatly in the work that we do, and we want to make sure to honor and respect her and her memory. But within River Nua, we have these core components of intergenerational learning experiences. We talk about Shoshone Bannock traditional knowledge and teachings and traditional spaces, places, wild landscapes, and rivers. And we start to recognize that when we situate our young people in learning and having it be relevant and relevant to our cultural identities, that they are then able to really see themselves in the context of the things that we're engaging in together in those learning spaces, whether it's STEM or part of River Noah. What we do too is we try to have like an integrative kind of perspective of things where we invite different tribal members with different expertise to come and share and talk and teach and learn with our students. And that's all the way from science to math to the arts, photographers, law, tribal law, and so on. So we have, every year is not the same. It just depends who we're bringing and what what their expertise is that they bring to the table. Ooh, excuse me. And then our goal with River Noah. So our goal is to increase representation and create space of equity through learning experiences on homelands with Shoshone Bannocks, Indigenous and minoritized communities on and off the river. And so although our main focus is to get tribal members on the water, we do work with individuals from other tribes as well as non-native people that are working to cultivate those relationships with us and partnerships. And next week, we're going to be talking to Dr. Vanessa Anthony Stevens, who speaks very well about these things, can elaborate, can articulate very well on cultivating relationships. But it is a framework and something we hold close to us. Within River Noah, we have these guiding values, which is to heal, honor, protect, and restore. And so we don't just look about going on land and learning a core standard of science or STEM or thinking about things very linearly, but we try to honor our youth and our children in a way that's holistic, and also understanding that there's historical trauma, that we are in this capacity of restorative justice as well. Some of the youth that we've been able to bring on the river, they're, the first of their family to come back in 100 years. And so really having that connection to land again, and again, that restorative justice is important to us. This is a picture of our daughter, Malia. She has been going on the river with her siblings since she was pretty little. So it's going to be interesting to see, pictures to capture this year because she's a lot bigger now. And I kind of wanted to get into these ideas because we talk a lot about Indigenous knowledge and pedagogy, and just to give some point of reference to the language we're using. And so I like to use this term. It's from the educational field and kind of something I like to come back to every now and then just to give us direction. But Indigenous knowledge can be described as wisdom needed to survive in a particular environment. Knowledge of how to live and interact in an extended family and Indigenous community. Indigenous knowledge is based on centuries of experience and close observations of one's surroundings, including plants, animals, and weather. That's not supposed to say that, I don't think. And then the picture here is a picture of my great-great-great-grandpa. No, I'm sorry, my great-great-grandpa. This is Ralph Dixie, and this is during the time of really pushing to have that assimilation of Eurocentric ideologies. And so on the left side, you can see him looking very handsome in his traditional clothing. And then on the other side, where he has, within just a few years, kind of moved over to more of a colonized experience. And that was a form of survival for us. However, that knowledge system and Indigenous knowledge continued to be passed down, even in some cases in a way that was secretive as a form of survival. And then just to give examples of how we practice Indigenous knowledge on the river with the Middle Fork. So we harvest and gather traditional foods throughout the whole year. And then when we're on the river, we celebrate and we have a traditional foods night. And some of the foods that we share with our young people, this is the first time they've ever had these kinds of foods. And on the other end, there's some kids who are very experienced with gathering traditional foods and are expert hunters, and sometimes are the ones that are also providing the food for the feast that we share. Then there's mussels. I think there's bighorn sheep in this picture, elk, deer, salmon. I think we have buffalo burger, and then we had some camas that we had prepared. And then on the right is this root that we really enjoy. It's called bear root. I'm not sure what the Shoshone name for is. I'd have to ask my daughter, our 9-year-old, who's our language expert. And then going into Indigenous pedagogy. So pedagogy is the idea of how we learn together. And Indigenous pedagogy is based on centuries of experience raising children to function productively in close-knit communities. Family members, elders, and other community members pass on this knowledge to each new generation. And this is more of a exchange of knowledge and learning together that is what we would consider to be informative. But we understand these cultural practices of, as an example, what Dr. Stevens was talking about. For his people, it's if you talk too much, that's saying something. And for us, we have our own nuances as Shoshone Bannock people, and we're very close and touchy-feely with our children, and that's a form of us expressing that we're showing love as an example. And then talking about bringing these ideas together and what does that look like in contemporary time. I like to use this example of Sam, who spoke earlier, where he is very versed in Western knowledge. He knows what he needs to do to fit into those institutional spaces. However, he is able to figure out how to be an Indigenous researcher, honoring and respecting the parts of being Shoshone Bannock. And we've gotten to a place now where, we can really confidently enter these spaces of research and be able to push back a little bit when we need to, or be able to advocate when needed. And then working with people who are not from our tribe, whether they're native or non-native, we really talk about this idea of cultural competency. And I know we had gone over this last week with Shani and having a little deeper discussion on cultural humility. And again, it's just this idea of you have to understand what your culture is and where you come from and your own parts of who you are in order to then engage in other cultures and fully be able to be in a space and honor and respect everyone in the room. And then when we do that, we are centering our cultural basis for learning, communicating high expectations, and reshaping curriculum to reflect student diversity. And this is what we're doing with River Noah. We are having college professors come on the river with us, and they're working with middle schoolers or elementary students or high schoolers, and they are able to really pick up on the information just because it's situated in a cultural context, and the professor and ourselves or other tribal community members from the Shoban tribes, we're able to bridge those places of understanding, and and it's all for the kids what it comes down to. And then these are just some more examples. We had shared these last week as well, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them. But we do a lot of mentorship. We do a lot of family style learning and camping. And I think something I didn't say last week was that the idea of learning within family units within the literature of Indigenous education is that there is a lot more moments of learning that take place when families are learning together. And then not only that, but we're also providing these social frameworks to look at healthy family styles or looking at social issues impacting our community. And so lots of things are going on when we're learning together. And you'll probably hear me say that many, many times. So with that, I think we did pretty good. I'm going to stop sharing, but before I do, I wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to get down our email if you might be interested in volunteering or have questions. It is rivernoah@gmail.com. And we thank you guys for your time. We also have a website at rivernoah.org. And I can put those in the chat while we have a discussion. All right, so I think I think it's open for conversation. We have about 15 minutes left before our workshop series is over. How are you all doing? Are you pretty burnt out and hungry? Yeah, Erin.
This is so great, Jessica. So inspired. What kind of volunteer opportunities are there?
Yeah, so we have volunteers, all kinds of different ones. The only thing that we ask is that the people we work with, that they come into this space with an idea of being of service. And so on the river, it's pretty expensive. It's about $4,000 per person that we provide for our tribal members and everybody who's with us for free. So anything, we've had people volunteer to like help cook, because Sam and I are essentially the ones in the background, staying up real late, cooking meals for the trip, packing, loading. If there is like an expertise of like some kind of learning or teaching, we've had photographers who came on the river and shared how to take like how to engage in photography with our young kids, our young people. People doing research and wanting to learn more about how to engage in research with tribal community that's more ethical, and just things we've been talking about this entire IMP. So lots of different ways to engage. Rowers, we work a lot, very closely with professional rowers and guides, which we love and appreciate very much. Any other questions?
Just thank you for taking the time to share all of this and to talk about this. And I'm just feeling really grateful for it. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. I have a bunch of funny stories if, we need to fill in time.
Jessica, I have a quick question, if that's
Yeah.
okay. I wanted to again echo what Aaron and Michael were saying, of just like a deep sense of gratitude for what you've shared with us. It's just such an immense privilege to hear. And also I'm amazed that you have time to like organize these workshop series, given like all the different, like you were like, oh, what all I do. And I was like, what the fuck? Like it's amazing. But if I could ask, can you maybe talk more to the like botanical like relationality that you have on the trip, or what you talk about in terms of the plant life?
Oh yeah.
Trees. I remember your husband talking about the cottonwood, and that was really moving for me as a botanist. But if you could talk maybe on that sphere.
Oh yeah, yep. So we have engaged in either bringing botanists with us, or just our knowledge that we've learned within our tribal community about identifying plants, and then identifying those same plants within on the middle fork of the Salmon. However, there's like all kinds of interesting things going on. So one of the things we were able to do, because it is a protected like wild scenic area, is like we're not allowed to cut down ponderosa pines. However, one had fallen while we were there, and we were able to take the cambium from it, and we were, just eating it and sharing a moment with our community, and how that's a food for us. And it was really interesting because we've had cambium before, like in the South Fork, and it's kind of a little bit harder and thinner. But then on the middle fork, it was like spongy, and it reminded me of like coconut meat, kind of. And so that was really interesting. And then other places on the middle fork, we see where there's house depressions, and then there's almost like this to me, it reminds me of this like cultivating of mussel beds. And it's almost like there's a mussel bed garden there. And then you can almost see like different gardens within the space, where there might have been like a big, garden of sunflowers that are, have lots of different ways to be eaten and preserved. And so you kind of start to identify like how our people used to live. And then at the same time, you know, we harvest our roots, and they're huge, huge roots. And to me, that's saying that, you know, there's this part about harvest that's reciprocal with plants too, where when you know, for example, our people, when you harvest, we don't take all of it. Like that's something we don't do. And we always leave some for the next generation or the next time. Um, but at the same end, if it's not harvested at all, it overgrows. And then there's these big, you know, tight roots that grow together, and that's sometimes not beneficial for plants. So there's this relationship, and this kind of part in the movie I was talking about is I honestly, in my heart, I feel this way and have nothing to back it up except our stories and relationship and community and to our land, is that I think our land missed us. And there's parts of that caretaking that, you know, when we're gathering these roots that are super overgrown, that there's like this exchange happening. And so I wouldn't say I can't back it up on, I back it up on our traditional knowledge and our traditional teachings. Whether Western science can agree with me or support that, I don't know. I haven't looked into the literature, but I know I can easily reference my community. Yeah, I love that question. I love plants, so that was great.
Yeah, thank you. And also, like, who cares if Western science can back it up? Like, who gives a
Yeah.
shit? Like, if they can or can't, they can suck it. Like, but thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question for you. So I guess first of all, thank you for sharing that. That was very beautiful and moving. And this is something that I've wondered about, like creating a nonprofit that, yeah, that I don't know, that has this like very like deep meaning and ties with like community and education and things. And I know from my like very limited background with environmental ed that oftentimes in that community still there's this big like push against programs that don't have that focus on like alignment with like the NGSS standards and the like, and there's still a lot of kind of like force into this box of what environmental education is supposed to be. And so I'm kind of wondering how you guys like met that when you were forming this organization and then ended up like, yeah, creating this very beautiful thing that is its own thing outside of
Yeah.
that. So yeah, what was that like, I guess?
I think I kind of think we approached it in the way that like we approach building lessons, because with nonprofits you have to check a box like this is what we're doing, and you know lots of other things are going on. And so just kind of what Philip was talking about earlier about like learning how to play the game. I feel like that is definitely the case within institutions. And I used to get so hurt, like when I would take an exam, for example, and I completely disagreed with what the answer was on the test. And then I had to tell myself, like, this is a lie. This isn't true. I don't agree with this. I don't agree with this one. I'm going to check it and this one. And I'd get like really good grades on tests. But I had to like understand that I had to separate this idea that I'm not having to fit in a box, that I actually surpass that box, or our nonprofit surpasses that box. But just to play the game, like I have to choose one. And so when we were making this film, it was so hard because the person we were working with, he's like, "What do you guys do?" And we're like, "We don't know. Like we're doing all this kind of stuff." And he actually helped us in kind of like narrowing down. Essentially, what Sam and I are doing is we're just trying to be healthy family and community members. And the work that we do just falls into that. And it's lots of different things. And but the biggest part of guiding and what I would suggest to you is that you have to understand what's your why. Like, why are you going into this field, or why are you seeking this knowledge? Because if you don't, you're going to be lost as well. And so I think once you figure out your why and what box fits closely, it doesn't mean you only have to do that thing, but like you are going to do that thing and then you can do more. So, and then part of what Nick had said about time. So a way that we push back on a lot of things, we just do things as a family. And so like our kids are home right now. They're like in the background, and they've been doing pretty good, but we've been bringing them to classes at the university. We take them to meetings, we take them wherever we go, and it's like you either want us or you don't. And I think once you have that stance, it's like you actually have a lot of time to do things because you're doing it as a family anyway. That's a good question. Any other questions?
I have a question on your nonprofit. So let's say, so can people sign up as families to go and go down the river? How does this work in terms of bringing non-Indigenous people into into learning more and enlightenment? So they
That's a
can
good
have the
question.
experience to
Yeah,
expand
so we really think about equity and access to our traditional homelands. The Middle Fork is a really great example. And a reason we picked it is not just because we're descendants from the Boise Valley or Tukadika, but also there's this idea of commodifying of our traditional homelands. And so if you have money and you have resources, you have a larger opportunity to access the Middle Fork, where our people who, monetarily struggle, or just have different priorities. They can't spend $4,000 for one person, let alone their whole family. And so we really try to center taking our tribal people down the Middle Fork. However, when we do have volunteers, we again think about what is the service that they can contribute when going down the river with us. So rowers, for example, we try to make it like the safest trip we can. So we usually work a great deal with professional guides. And then the other people that we bring, it's usually just like one person or like in their family unit, because again, we're trying to address equity. And so if for example, if you were to come down the river with us and you were in education, we would want you to take a moment to maybe teach something or have some kind of learning lesson going on. However, we would want you and expect you to be putting in the work to understand what is cultural relevant practices, how to engage in our people and with our youth, to not perpetuate, stereotypes or any ways that might unintentionally cause harm. So we're very protective of our people. And we don't just throw you on the river with us either. Like we take time beforehand, probably 2-3 weeks. We're in communications on like, what is the work that we need to be putting in before we even, are together physically and in the same space. And being on the river for 7 days, you get to know people really well. And, we really want to take care of our community who's already vulnerable. And so that's kind of the idea of volunteering. We have on our website, there is a place to contact us or send an application. And yeah. Yes. And thank you, Sam. And there's only 30 people we can take on the river with us at a time. And so like we try to have anywhere between 10 to 13 tribal youth. And then we have to think about our rowers, and we have to think about, the other people facilitating. So really, probably like 4 or 5 volunteers is about our max per trip. Any other questions? I think we have time for one more, and then we're going to have to end this IMP workshop. And if there's no more questions, I just want to say again that I really appreciate the time that you guys are spending with us within this IMP workshop. I know there was moments where we get into discussions that might feel uncomfortable, but we can't grow if we're not getting into these points where we have to experience a little discomfort. But I hope everybody felt supported and safe, and that we are a resource for each other. I'm also going to be in Moscow next week, so if anybody wants to maybe catch coffee or something like that, I'm going to be working on a few things and have moments here and there to maybe meet you guys in person. But thank you all. And I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat too. I think it's in Google, but
Thank you so much. This was great.
thank you. Right. Well, thank you guys. We'll see you hopefully next week.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.